The hardest part of eulogizing a man you never fully understood is deciding which version of him deserves the microphone. I chose the version that built Harrington Capital from a single rented desk. I chose the version that taught me to shake hands like I meant it. I did not choose the version who called at midnight 3 weeks before he died and said my name twice, just my name, before hanging up. The chapel was standing room only, 200 people in dark suits and darker intentions, arranged in mahogany pews that smelled of lemon oil and old money. The flowers were white, lilies, roses, something architectural I couldn't name, and they had been arranged with the kind of precision my father would have appreciated. Nothing accidental, nothing wasted. I pressed my thumb into my palm beneath the podium's edge and began. Thomas Harrington was a man who built things. My voice sounded foreign to me, broadcast through speakers I couldn't see, bouncing off stone walls and returning with a half-second delay that made every word feel like an echo of someone else's thoughts. He built a company, emotion. Tense nah, he built a family. He built a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered and lingered long after he left. I did not say, he also built walls, thick ones. The kind you don't notice until you've been pressing your face against them for 40 years. Evelyn's hand found my arm as I returned to my seat. She squeezed once, firm, deliberate, calibrated, the way she always touched me when we were being observed. Tense perfume reached me a moment later, jasmine layered over something cooler, and I breathed it in the way you breathe in anything familiar, without thinking, without questioning, without wondering what it might be covering. Beautiful, she whispered. He would have been proud. I nodded, emotion. My father had never once told me he was proud, but Evelyn had a gift for rewriting history in real time, filing down the sharp edges of what actually happened, and presenting the smoothed version as if it had always been the truth. I loved her for it. That was what I told myself. I loved her for it. Michael was sitting one row behind us, close enough that I could hear the leather of his jacket creak when he leaned forward. Tince clapped me on the shoulder as I settled into the pew, hard enough to feel deliberate, soft enough to pass as affection. Hell of a speech, brother, he said. His green eyes held that familiar warmth, the steady certainty that had anchored me through every board meeting gone sideways, every quarterly loss, every 3 a.m. phone call when the numbers didn't add up and the walls of my office felt like they were shrinking. Michael Lawson, the best friend a man could ask for, the one who showed up, the one who stayed. I turned my wedding ring once, twice, and stared at the casket. The service continued. A minister who didn't know my father recited passages my father never read. Business associates delivered anecdotes polished to a corporate sheen. Richard Caldwell, who'd served on the board for 20 years, described my father as a man of uncommon integrity, and I pressed my thumb harder into my palm until the knuckle cracked. Integrity, emotion. The words sat in my mouth like a small stone. I watched the mourners file past. Black suits blurring into a river of wool and condolences and handshakes that lasted exactly 2 seconds each. Tense Evelyn handled them beautifully. She always did, standing beside me with her hand resting on the small of my back, her smile a perfect calibration of sorrow and grace. She knew every name, she remembered every spouse, every child, every recent surgery or promotion. Emotion. She was magnificent at this. The architecture of grief, managed to perfection. Michael worked the other side of the room, looser, warmer, deflecting tears with humor the way he deflected everything, rotating between clusters of mourners with the ease of a man who genuinely enjoyed other people. He caught my eye from across the chapel at one point and gave me a slight nod, and I felt the familiar rush of gratitude that he was here, that he existed, that in a room full of people performing sympathy, at least one person actually knew me. That was what I believed. Emotion. That was the operating assumption upon which I had structured 23 years of friendship, a business partnership, and the quiet certainty that no matter what happened, there was one person in my corner who would never leave. The reception dragged. I stood by the window of the family estate's east parlor, nursing a bourbon I didn't want and watching the late afternoon light fracture through crystal decanters on the sideboard. The room smelled of my father's cigars, the ghost of them, trapped in the curtains and the leather chairs and the walls themselves. 20 years of smoke absorbed into the architecture. You could renovate every surface, and that smell would remain, seeping from the foundation. Plea, emotion. Marcus appeared at my elbow. My son had dressed in the one suit he owned, the charcoal one we bought for his college interviews 3 years ago, and it was already too short in the sleeves. His dark curls were uncombed in a way that was either deliberate or genuine. With Marcus, you could never tell, and his eyes, those green hazel eyes that came from wherever they came from, were red-rimmed and uncertain, emotion. "Dad?" He stood the way he always stood near me, slightly angled, as if preparing to either lean in or step back depending on what I needed. "Yeah, are you okay?" I looked at my son, 22 years old. An artist in a family of builders, gentle in a way that had no precedent, not from my side, not from Evelyn's performed elegance, not from Thomas Harrington's boardroom brutality. Marcus was something none of us had manufactured, and I loved him with a ferocity that frightened me sometimes, because it was the one thing in my life I had never needed to construct or defend or justify: emotion. "Tense, I'm fine," I said, which was the answer he expected, and the lie we both accepted. He squeezed my arm, differently from Evelyn, without calibration, without performance, and drifted back toward the kitchen, where I could hear someone arranging catering trays with the efficient clatter of professional grief management. I turned back to the window. The sun was setting behind the tree line, turning the sky the color of a bruise. That was when the attorney appeared. Grant Addison had been my father's lawyer for 30 years. A thin, precise man with silver spectacles and the particular posture of someone who has carried other people's secrets long enough that the weight has become structural. He materialized beside me with the quiet competence of a man who knew exactly how much space to occupy. "David." His voice was low, angled away from the room. "I need a moment." "In private. Now. It can't wait." I followed him into the study, my father's study, which still smelled of leather and ink and the faint metallic edge of the safe behind the bookcase, and he closed the door with a click that sounded louder than it should have. "Your father left a separate document," Addison said. He removed his spectacles, cleaned them, replaced them. A delay I recognized from 1,000 negotiations, the pause before the number that changes everything. "Outside the will, addressed to you personally, with specific instructions." "Instructions for what?" Addison looked at me the way people look at a building they know is about to be condemned. "That," he said, "is what I'm afraid of." The reading of Thomas Harrington's will took place in a room designed for endings. Dark wood paneling that absorbed sound the way old churches absorb confession. Heavy velvet drapes the color of dried blood, pulled tight against windows that hadn't been opened in years. You could smell it, the trapped air, stale and sweet with furniture polish and the ghost of 1,000 signatures. A grandfather clock in the corner marked time with the kind of slow, authoritative ticking that pressed against your eardrums like a pulse that wasn't yours. Evelyn sat beside me in a black dress that cost more than most people's rent, her hands folded in her lap like a prayer she didn't believe in. Grant Addison had arranged the chairs in a semicircle facing his desk, the leather seats cracking softly beneath our weight as we settled in. The desk was walnut, scarred with decades of use, its surface carrying a faint ring of moisture from a glass someone had set down and forgotten. I focused on that ring while Addison spoke, tracing its circumference with my eyes the way you trace the edge of a wound before you decide whether it needs stitches. "The primary distribution is straightforward," Addison began, sliding a stack of documents across the polished surface. The paper whispered against the wood. His voice had the practiced neutrality of a surgeon describing the incision before he makes it. Thomas Harrington's personal assets, real estate holdings, and his controlling interest in Harrington Capital passed jointly to David and Evelyn Harrington. The estate in Greenwich, the apartment on Park Avenue, the Aspen property, all detailed in Appendix B. Evelyn's hand found mine beneath the table. Her fingers were cool, always cool, even in summer, as if some essential warmth had been diverted elsewhere long ago, and she traced her thumb across my knuckles once. I recognized the gesture, reassurance, the kind she deployed when she sensed I was drifting into analysis rather than feeling. It was, I realized much later, a correction, a small tug on the leash to keep me in the emotional register where I was easier to manage. But I didn't know that then. Then I just held her hand and listened to the grandfather clock count the seconds between one life and whatever came next. The numbers were considerable. I knew they would be. I had spent my adult life inside the machine my father built, and I understood its dimensions, but hearing them catalogued in Addison's careful monotone made them feel different. Less like achievement and more like architecture, a structure someone had constructed around me, room by room, until it became indistinguishable from my own skeleton. "Is there anything else?" I asked, when Addison paused to turn a page. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and I could hear the grain of it beneath his fingertips. He looked at me over the rim of his spectacles. The pause lasted 2 seconds. I counted them in clock ticks. "There is a secondary matter." He opened a drawer, the wooden runners groaned with age, and removed a sealed envelope. Heavy stock, my father's monogram, embossed in the corner in ink so dark it was almost black. The wax seal caught the desk lamp's light and threw a small, blood-colored reflection onto the ceiling. "Your father arranged a safe deposit box at First National, number 1147. This contains the key and a letter. His instructions were explicit. This is to be opened by you alone." "By me alone," I repeated. Emotion. My voice sounded thin in the heavy room, absorbed by the paneling and the drapes and the decades of other men's secrets that lived in the walls. Evelyn's thumb stopped moving on my knuckles. The stillness was sudden enough that I registered it the way you register a sound stopping, not by what came after, but by the absence of what had been. "That's correct." Addison placed the envelope on the desk between us. He was quite specific. No copies, no representatives. "You, personally, at the vault." I picked up the envelope. It weighed almost nothing, which seemed wrong. A thing that heavy with intention should have had the density of lead. I ran my finger along the seal, feeling the wax crack and crumble under the pressure like old bone, and smelled something. Ink, or iron, or the particular metallic residue that expensive fountain pens leave on paper when the writer presses too hard. Evelyn leaned toward me. Her jasmine perfume preceded her, cutting through the room's stale air like a knife through gauze. "What is it?" Her voice carried the perfect pitch of concerned curiosity, but something in its timing, a fraction too quick, as if the question had been loaded and ready before Addison finished speaking, registered in a part of my brain I wasn't yet paying attention to. "I don't know," I said, which was true. Addison excused himself, citing the need to prepare additional documentation. The door clicked shut with the solid finality of good hardware. The grandfather clock continued its indifferent counting. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. I opened the envelope. The key was brass, tarnished at the edges, small enough to press into my palm and leave an impression. The kind of key that opens a box, not a door, a distinction that would matter later. The letter was a single page, handwritten in my father's distinctive script, heavy downstrokes, minimal curves, every letter formed with the angular precision of a man who considered legibility a form of discipline. The paper smelled of the cedar-lined drawer it had waited in. How long? Weeks? Months? Had he written this while I was sitting across from him at Sunday dinners, carving the roast, performing the patriarch? I read it once, then I read it again. The words didn't change, but their meaning shifted, the way a photograph changes when you learn the context of who took it and why. "David, I should have told you this in person. I tried. You remember the call. I couldn't finish." Emotion. The deal that built Harrington Capital was never clean. The founding agreement has a flaw I spent 40 years containing. The details are in box 1147. Do not discuss this with anyone. Not Evelyn, not Michael, not the board. Protect Marcus. Whatever you find, whatever conclusions you draw, protect Marcus first. I will not apologize. Apologies are retrospective, and I'm writing this looking forward, toward whatever you become once you know the truth. I stared at the paper. The room had gone very quiet, or maybe I had. The clock was still ticking, the drapes were still breathing their stale velvet breath, but all of it had receded behind a wall of white noise that lived somewhere between my ears and my chest. The ink was slightly smudged in the bottom corner, as if a hand had rested there too long while the signature dried. My father's hand. Broad, liver-spotted, the signet ring leaving a faint indentation in the paper. The deal that built Harrington Capital was never clean. I turned my wedding ring. Once, twice, 3 times. The platinum was warm from my skin. and for the first time I noticed how it caught the light differently from the brass key sitting in my other palm. One polished to perform, the other tarnished with truth. Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She had gone to the restroom, or said she had, and her lipstick was freshly applied, a shade of muted rose that cost $80 a tube and never transferred to coffee cups or collarbones. She looked at the letter in my hand and then at my face, and something in her expression shifted by a degree so small I almost missed it. Almost. David, what did he say? I folded the letter and put it in my breast pocket, next to where the eulogy had been. The paper settled against my chest, and I could feel it there, thin as a leaf, heavy as a verdict. Nothing important, I said. It was the first deliberate lie I had told my wife in 25 years of marriage. It sat in my mouth like a foreign object, angular, wrong, tasting of the copper tang you get when you bite your tongue. But there was something else beneath the wrongness, something I didn't have a name for yet, the faint electric charge of having a secret that was entirely mine. I drove home with Evelyn beside me, her hand on my knee, the car smelling of her perfume and the autumn rain that had started falling somewhere between the attorney's office and the highway on-ramp. She filled the silence with logistical plans, the estate, the probate timeline, whether to list the Greenwich house now or wait until spring, and her voice had that particular quality it took on when she was constructing normalcy. Smooth, confident, impenetrable. I answered when required. I nodded when expected. Emotion, Willie, and emotion. I processed none of it, because underneath every word, every plan, every carefully constructed sentence about real estate and tax implications and the appropriate mourning period, one question was building pressure behind my sternum like a hairline fracture spreading through load-bearing bone. Why would Marcus need protection? Emotion. My father's office still smelled like him. That was the first thing. Before the files, before the numbers, before the name I didn't recognize, the smell. Cigar smoke embedded so deeply in the leather chair that no amount of airing could extract it. Ink from the Mont Blanc he kept in the top drawer, the cap always slightly loose because he believed a ready pen was the mark of a decisive man, and underneath it all, the faint metallic scent of a room that had been locked since the day he went to the hospital and never came back. I sat down in his chair. The leather groaned beneath my weight, still molded to his shape, broader than mine, deeper in the seat, and for a moment I was 12 years old again, standing in this doorway while he signed documents and pretended I wasn't there. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the surface, illuminating the dust that had settled on everything like a fine grey shroud. The filing cabinet yielded to the small key Addison had provided along with the safe deposit box number. The lock turned with a reluctant click, and the top drawer slid open to reveal hanging folders arranged with the obsessive precision I had inherited and never questioned. Color-coded tabs, chronological order, every transaction, every contract, every handshake that had ever become paper. I started at the beginning, Harrington Capital, Year 1. The founding documents were clean, or appeared to be. Articles of incorporation, the initial capitalization agreement, early investor contracts. I recognized the names, the old Boston money families who had backed my father's vision of a boutique investment firm built on personal relationships rather than algorithmic trading. I recognized the signatures. I recognized the language, legal boilerplate rendered in the particular idiom of wealth that speaks in passive voice and conditional tense. But on the third page of the founding agreement, there was a name I didn't recognize. Catherine Vale, equity partner, 37% stake. I read it twice. 37%, not a minor investor, not an advisory board member, an equity partner with a stake larger than any of the initial backers, larger in fact than my father's own founding share of 35%. I had never heard the name before, not in 28 years of working at the company my father built, not in a single board meeting, a single annual report, a single family dinner where business was discussed the way other families discuss the weather. Catherine Vale did not exist in the history of Harrington Capital, and yet, according to the document in my hands, original, signed, notarized, she had once owned more of it than anyone. I opened the next folder, and the next. The paper whispered against my fingers, each page releasing a small puff of dust and cedar. The story built itself in increments. Catherine Vale's name appeared on 17 documents spanning the first 4 years of operations, then disappeared entirely. No buyout agreement, no transfer of equity, no death certificate, no resignation letter, no record of dissolution. She was simply there, woven into the foundation of everything, and then she was not. Except for one thing. In the 7th folder, Year 5, Q3, I found a series of wire transfers. Monthly payments routed through a shell company called Meridian Holdings LLC, sent to an account I couldn't trace without more information. The amounts were consistent, $12,000 a month, every month, for what appeared to be decades. The payments had originated from my father's personal account, not from Harrington Capital's corporate funds. Private money, hidden channels, consistent payments to someone who had been erased from the record. I leaned back in the chair and pressed my thumb into my palm until the knuckle whitened. The office was very quiet. Outside the window, the city pulsed with its usual indifferent energy. Car horns, distant sirens, the rhythmic flash of a traffic signal 42 floors below, and I sat inside that sound the way you sit inside a shell, aware of the ocean, insulated from it. I photographed every relevant page with my phone, closed the cabinet, and locked it. Then I sat in the dark for 10 minutes, doing the thing I do when the numbers don't add up. I built the case in my head, examined it from every angle, and tried to find the interpretation that didn't require my father to be a liar. I couldn't find one. I drove home. The house was lit from within, every window glowing with the warm amber light that Evelyn preferred. She had specific opinions about color temperature, about how light shaped mood, about the difference between a house that welcomed and a house that merely sheltered. I pulled into the garage and sat in the car for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, smelling the leather seats and the traces of her jasmine perfume that had migrated from the passenger seat where she sat every morning when I drove her to her Pilates class. Inside, the kitchen smelled of rosemary and roasted garlic. Evelyn was plating something elegant. She always cooked when she was stressed, though she would never use that word, preferring to say she found it meditative, and she looked up when I came in with the kind of smile that covered a room like wallpaper, seamless, warm, and applied. "Long day?" she asked. Went through some of Dad's files. I hung my coat on the hook by the door, straightened my tie out of habit, and noticed her phone on the counter, face down. She never left her phone face down. Or did she? Had I ever paid attention before? Find anything interesting? She turned back to the stove, and I watched her shoulders, the way they were set, slightly higher than usual, as if braced against something I hadn't said yet. Old contracts. Nothing that won't keep. I opened the refrigerator for a beer I didn't want, and stood in the cold white light, letting it wash the cigar smoke memory from my face. "How was your day?" "Quiet. Lunch with Margaret." "Some errands." I closed the refrigerator. The phone was still face down on the counter. I looked at it the way you look at a locked door in a house you thought you knew, with the sudden, unwelcome awareness that you have never checked what was behind it because you assumed you already knew. The doorbell rang. Michael. 2 bottles of wine and a grin that could disarm a boardroom. "Heard you've been playing detective in the old man's office," he said, clapping me on the shoulder as he passed. The cologne he wore, something woody and assertive, trailed behind him like a signature. "Anything good, or just dusty financial archaeology?" "Who told you I was there?" Michael was already in the kitchen, setting the wine on the island, greeting Evelyn with a kiss on the cheek that lasted exactly the appropriate duration. "Ran into Evelyn at Morrison's this afternoon. She mentioned you'd been going through things." I looked at Evelyn. She didn't look back. "Morrison's," I said. Morrison's was a restaurant on the east side. Evelyn had said her day was quiet. Lunch with Margaret. Some errands. Morrison's was not an errand. Morrison's was where you went when you wanted to be somewhere specific, with someone specific, in a booth with a leather banquette and a wine list that started at $90. "Just stopped in for a coffee," Evelyn said, turning from the stove with 2 plates. Her voice was the same temperature it always was, warm, certain, unconcerned. Margaret and I ducked in on the way back from the salon. "Right," I said. The words sat between the 3 of us like a coin placed on a table. Heads, I believed her. Tails, something I wasn't ready to name. Michael poured the wine. Evelyn served the meal. I ate, and I listened, and I watched the way my best friend and my wife moved around each other in my kitchen. The choreography of 2 people who knew exactly where the other would be, the way dancers know, the way people who have rehearsed know. I noticed, and then I unnoticed, the way you unsee a crack in a wall you've walked past 1,000 times. Not because it isn't there, but because acknowledging it means acknowledging that the wall might not hold. That night, I lay in bed beside Evelyn and listened to her breathe, even, measured, the breathing of someone who had no trouble sleeping. I stared at the ceiling and turned my wedding ring in the dark, and thought about Catherine Vale, and shell companies, and a phone left face down on a counter, and a restaurant no one told me about. Separate threads, unconnected. They had to be, but in the silence of that bedroom, with the city humming its indifferent lullaby beyond the windows, I could feel them beginning to converge. Slowly, reluctantly, the way two fault lines approach each other in the dark geology beneath a city that believes it is built on solid ground. I turned the brass key in box 1147 and felt the mechanism engage with a click that resonated through my wrist and into my forearm. A small mechanical confession from a box that had been holding its breath. Inside, arranged with my father's characteristic precision, were 3 manila envelopes, a single micro-cassette tape, and a photograph of a woman I had never seen. The vault's private viewing room was a windowless cube with a steel table, a chair bolted to the floor, and a fluorescent light that hummed at a frequency designed, whether intentionally or not, to make you want to leave. I didn't leave. I sat down, set the contents before me like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was prosecuting, and pressed my thumb into my palm until the joint cracked. A habit I developed in my 20s during my first hostile acquisition, the body's way of asking the mind if it was sure it wanted to proceed. The photograph first. A woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back, sharp features arranged in an expression I recognized because I wore it myself, the concentrated attention of someone solving a problem that interested them more than the people in the room. She was standing in front of what appeared to be the original Harrington Capital office, a cramped storefront on Beacon Street that I'd seen in exactly one framed photograph in my father's study, from the era before the glass towers and the corner offices. She was holding a folder, and her posture, feet planted, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, was the posture of someone who owned the ground she stood on. Catherine Vale, it had to be. I turned the photograph over. My father's handwriting on the back, CV, 1987, Founding Day, Founding Day. She had been there on the day Harrington Capital opened its doors, not as a guest, not as an employee, as a founder. And I, the man who had spent 28 years inside that company, who had given it my best decades, who had built my entire identity around the assumption that I understood its bones, had never heard her name spoken once. Not in a board meeting, not at a shareholder dinner, not in a single one of the stories my father told about the early days. She had been excised with surgical precision, and the wound had healed so cleanly that no scar remained. The thoughts settled into me like cold water filling a basement. How do you erase a founder? I opened the first envelope, legal documents. Dense, single-spaced, the particular dialect of contract law that requires a specialized vocabulary and the assumption that every sentence might one day be read aloud in a courtroom. I spread them across the steel table, and the paper, stiffer than modern stock, slightly yellowed at the edges, released a faint smell of age and cedar, the same scent that clung to my father's filing cabinets. The founding agreement. Catherine Vale, PhD in finance from Wharton, had approached Thomas Harrington in 1986 with a proprietary trading methodology she had developed during 3 years of independent research. The methodology was the engine. Harrington provided the capital and the connections. They formed Harrington Capital as partners, Vale with 37% equity reflecting intellectual property contribution, Harrington with 35%, 37%, larger than my father's own stake, emotion. I sat with that number for a long time. I let it rearrange the architecture of everything I'd believed about my family's legacy. My father, the self-made man, the visionary, the patriarch who built an empire from nothing, hadn't built it from nothing. He'd built it from someone, from her methodology, her research, her 3 years of solitary intellectual labor. And then he had taken her name off the building. The second envelope held the story of how, memos, handwritten notes, a timeline of meetings. March 1991, Catherine Vale files a formal dispute regarding equity dilution. She alleges that an amendment to the founding agreement, reducing her stake from 37% to 4%, was executed without her authorization. June 1991. Vale's legal representation sends a cease and desist regarding the unauthorized use of her proprietary methodology. September 1991. A settlement. $480,000 lump sum and monthly disbursements of $12,000 routed through the shell company I'd already found, Meridian Holdings. In exchange, she relinquished all claims and agreed to the removal of her name from all corporate records. $480,000 for a 37% stake in a company that by the time my father died was valued at $2.3 billion. I pressed my palm flat against the steel table and felt the cold seep through my skin. My father's annotations filled the margins in his Mont Blanc ink. Clean exit, no loose ends, handled. The word turned in my stomach like something swallowed wrong. I knew that word. I had used it myself, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the careful language of men who reduce human beings to line items. And for the first time, sitting in that underground room with the fluorescent light buzzing its indifferent psalm, I wondered how many of my own clean exits had actually been clean. How much of the precision I'd inherited from my father was discipline, and how much was the learned habit of looking away at exactly the right moment. The third envelope contained the forged amendment. I say forged because I recognized the wrongness immediately, not with a forensic analyst's training, but with 30 years of signing and countersigning documents, the muscle memory of a man whose signature was currency. Catherine Vale's signature on that amendment had the technical shape of authenticity, but the strokes lacked the unconscious fluidity of someone writing their own name. The connecting letters hesitated where they should have flowed. The pressure was inconsistent, heavier at the start of each letter, as if the hand that held the pen was thinking too carefully about how to be someone else. My father had built Harrington Capital on a forgery. The methodology was stolen. The equity was stolen. The name was stolen. Everything I had inherited, the corner office, the board seat, the respect, the handshakes, the 28 years of my professional identity, rested on a foundation of fraud so complete that even the victim's name had been scrubbed from the record. I put the documents back in exact order. I locked the box. I walked through the marble lobby with the controlled stride of a man who had just learned that the ground beneath his feet was made of paper. And I kept walking because stopping would require acknowledging what I'd found, and I was not ready to stand still in the ruins of my father's truth. The drive home was automatic, muscle memory steering while my mind disassembled and reassembled the facts. The city blurred past in amber streetlight and wet asphalt, and I arrived at my house with no memory of a single intersection. Evelyn's car was gone. The garage door opened onto her empty space, and the concrete floor where she usually parked was bare except for a small oil stain from the BMW, a mark she'd been meaning to have cleaned for months but never did, because there was always something more pressing, always another committee, another gala, another lunch. She had said she would be home all day. Working on the benefit gala, she'd said, "I'll be here, call if you need anything." The house was dark. The alarm beeped its welcome as I entered through the kitchen door, and the sound echoed through rooms that should have had someone in them. Her coffee sat on the island counter, cold, a skin of cream forming on the surface. Her laptop glowed with a seating chart she'd been working on, the cursor blinking in an empty cell, waiting for a name that would never be typed. Her robe was on the bedroom chair, still warm. I stood in the kitchen and thought about forgeries, about how the shape of a thing can be perfect, every letter correct, every curve in place, and still be fundamentally, irrevocably wrong, about how the only way to detect the deception is to feel for the hesitation, the places where the hand that held the pen was performing rather than being. I called Evelyn, 6 rings, voicemail. The text came 11 minutes later, running a quick errand. Back in 30, want me to pick up anything? XO. 2 exclamation points. Evelyn never used exclamation points. She considered them the punctuation of people who couldn't convey enthusiasm through word choice. And yet there they were, bright, eager, performing normalcy the way a forger performs a signature. Technically correct, emotionally wrong. I put the phone down on the counter, face up, deliberately, conspicuously face up, and poured a bourbon I didn't taste and sat in the dark kitchen waiting for a woman whose absence I had never questioned before. Because questioning her had always felt like questioning the foundation. And now I knew what could happen to a foundation. Emotion. There is a specific kind of relief that functions as its own warning sign. It arrives too large, too complete, too perfectly shaped to the anxiety it's meant to dissolve. The way a key fits a lock that was manufactured by the same person. Evelyn's explanation for yesterday's absence came with a receipt, a timeline, and the name of a friend who would corroborate every detail, and I accepted all of it with the gratitude of a drowning man who refuses to notice that the hand pulling him up is wet. She was standing at the kitchen island when I came down for coffee, already dressed, already composed, already 3 steps ahead of whatever I might ask. The receipt sat on the marble counter beside her phone, face up this time, deliberately visible, like a prop placed on a stage by someone who understood blocking. "I meant to tell you last night," she said, pouring my coffee from the French press with the exact amount of cream she'd memorized 2 decades ago. "Margaret's appointment ran late, so we grabbed lunch after. Sorrento's was packed. You know how Saturdays are. I lost track of time." She set the mug in front of me. The ceramic was warm. The coffee smelled of hazelnut, my preference, not hers. "I'm sorry I didn't call." I picked up the receipt. Sorrento Salon and Spa, 11:47 a.m., 2:15 p.m., haircut, color treatment, express facial, $387, tip, $80. Signed in Evelyn's immaculate cursive, fluid, unhesitating, the penmanship of a woman who had never questioned the value of her own signature. The timing worked, the charges were consistent. Margaret Green would confirm every detail if I called her, which I knew because Evelyn knew I knew, which was the architecture of the thing. She had constructed an explanation so airtight that questioning it would make me the unreasonable one. The man with the problem. The husband whose grief had metastasized into suspicion. I set the receipt down and drank my coffee. "It's fine," I said, and in the moment I meant it, or I meant to mean it, which in a 25-year marriage amounts to the same thing. Evelyn touched her collarbone once, a quick brush of her fingertips across the hollow of her throat, and turned back to the counter. I noticed the gesture. I filed it away in the same drawer where I'd filed the phone face down, the Morrison's restaurant, the exclamation points. I didn't open the drawer. I pushed it closed with the heel of my palm and told myself that grief does strange things to perception, that a man who had just discovered his father was a fraud was not in a position to judge the people who hadn't betrayed him yet. Yet, emotion. The words surfaced like a bubble from the bottom of something deep and dark, and I swallowed my coffee to push it back down. That evening, Michael took me to dinner at Luca's. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in the meatpacking district. Exposed brick, blackened steel beams, Edison bulbs casting the kind of amber light that made everyone look wealthy and forgivable. Michael had a table in the back corner, the one he always requested, visible enough to be seen, private enough to talk. He was already seated when I arrived, a bourbon in front of him, his phone face down on the white tablecloth. Face down, I noticed. I filed. "You look like hell, brother," he said, standing to pull me into a hug that lasted 1 beat longer than necessary. His cologne, that same woody assertiveness, filled the space between us, and his hand gripped my shoulder with the particular pressure of a man who wanted you to know he was strong enough to carry you. "How are you holding up?" "Managing," I said, which was true in the way that all one-word answers to complex questions are true. Technically accurate, emotionally incomplete. He ordered for both of us, the sea bass, the roasted potatoes, a bottle of Barolo he said the sommelier had recommended but which I suspected he'd already chosen before arriving. Michael did this. He arranged the environment so that by the time you sat down, the only decisions left were the ones he'd already made for you. "So the estate," he said, swirling his bourbon. The ice clinked against the glass with the precision of a metronome. "Addison get everything sorted? Standard distribution. Evelyn and I inherit jointly. And that's it?" His green eyes held mine. Steady, warm, the eyes of a man who had listened to me complain about quarterly losses at 2 a.m. and never once made me feel small for it. Nothing unusual? No surprises from the old man? The question was casual. The delivery was perfect. Light concern, a friend checking in. But beneath it, in the architecture of the pause between unusual and no surprises, there was something I hadn't heard in Michael's voice before. Precision. The kind of precision that belongs in a deposition, not a dinner. "Nothing worth mentioning," I said. Michael nodded, and his jaw relaxed by a fraction. A release of tension I wouldn't have noticed a week ago, before I'd started cataloguing the difference between people who were genuinely at ease and people who were performing it. The dinner progressed through its courses with the practiced rhythm of 2 men who had shared 1,000 meals. We talked about the company, quarterly projections, a potential acquisition in the biotech sector, the board's anxiety about market volatility. Michael was brilliant at this. The casual intelligence, the effortless command of numbers and narratives, the ability to make you feel like you were the smartest person in the room by agreeing with everything you said. His phone buzzed twice on the tablecloth. He glanced at it, and I saw the screen in the reflection of his wineglass. Inverted, distorted, but legible for the fraction of a second before he picked it up. A text notification. Emotion. The name was a single letter, E. The preview showed a heart emoji and the beginning of a sentence I couldn't read. Michael palmed the phone with the fluid efficiency of a card sharp. One motion, screen to pocket, no pause, no ripple in the conversation. "Sorry, my sister," he said, reaching for the breadbasket. "She's in town this weekend, wants to have brunch." His sister's name was Christine. I knew this because I had been at her wedding in Nantucket 12 years ago. I knew this because I had signed the card. I knew this because Michael had complained about her taste in men at exactly this table, in exactly this booth, 3 years ago. And her name, Christine, not a name that began with E, had been spoken so many times that evening that it had become a kind of punctuation. Michael picked up his wineglass and looked at me over the rim, with the steady warmth of a man who had nothing to hide, and I looked back at him and felt the splinter slide deeper, not into my skin, but into the load-bearing wall behind it. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Just tired," I said. "It's been a week." "It has, brother." He reached across the table and gripped my forearm briefly. The gesture was warm, genuine, the touch of a man I had trusted with my fears and my finances, and the quiet hours when the work wasn't enough to fill the space where purpose should have been. "But you're not alone in this. You know that, right? Whatever you need." I believed him. I sat across from my best friend in a restaurant that smelled of truffle oil and fresh bread, with a bottle of Barolo worth more than some people's rent between us, and I believed him the way I had believed him for 23 years, completely, reflexively, the way you believe the floor will hold your weight because it always has. I believed him because the alternative was a world in which the floor was made of paper, and I had already discovered one paper floor this week. I was not ready for two. The drive home was quiet. Evelyn was asleep when I arrived, or appeared to be, her breathing even, her body curved toward her side of the bed with the practiced stillness of someone who had been waiting. The room smelled of her night cream, something with retinol and rose, and the jasmine perfume that lingered in the sheets like a residue. I lay beside her in the dark and turned my wedding ring. The platinum caught a sliver of streetlight through the curtains and threw a small, cold spark onto the ceiling. E. The letter sat in my mind the way a stone sits at the bottom of a glass, visible through the liquid, distorting everything above it, impossible to remove without emptying the glass entirely. I believed him. I always believe him. But somewhere in the architecture of that belief, in the space between the floor and the foundation, a crack had opened that no amount of trust could plaster over. Not because of what I'd seen, a letter, an emoji, a lie about a sister whose name started with C, but because of what I'd felt in the moment he said it, the absolute practiced smoothness of a man who had told that particular lie before, many times before. I had spent my professional life reading documents that other people hoped I would misunderstand, contracts designed to obscure, financial statements engineered to mislead, prospectuses written in a language that looked like English but functioned as camouflage. So when I found the email chain between my wife and my best friend, unguarded, intimate, stretching back years, I did not react the way a normal man would. I read it the way I read everything, systematically, completely, cataloguing every line as evidence in a case I was only now realizing I had been building all along. It was a Tuesday. Evelyn was upstairs in the shower, the water running through the walls, a sound I had listened to 10,000 times without ever wondering what it concealed. I had come into the study for a flash drive, and her laptop was open on the desk, unlocked, the screen glowing in the dark room like a confession no one had asked for. The email at the top was from Michael. The subject line was empty. The body read, "Wednesday works. Same place. Miss you. Miss you." I stood in front of the screen for what must have been 30 seconds but felt like the duration of a held breath. Then I sat down in her chair, still warm from her body, still carrying the faint impression of her jasmine perfume in the leather, and I scrolled. The chain went back months, then years. I scrolled past dates I recognized, our anniversary, Marcus's 21st birthday, the weekend we'd spent at the lake house while Michael was supposedly in Chicago. The language was careful at first, coded in the way that people who are accustomed to being careful write when they think no one is reading. Oblique references, initials instead of names, times without locations. But as the chain deepened, as I moved backward through the archive of their parallel life, the language loosened, the codes fell away, the emails became letters, and the letters became something I had no word for, because the vocabulary of intimacy is different when it belongs to someone else. I read a message from Evelyn to Michael, dated 3 years ago, that described a weekend I had spent at a conference in San Francisco. She wrote about the silence in our house after I left, about the way the rooms felt different without me in them. Not empty, she wrote, but available. The word bored into me like a drill bit, finding the exact center of something load-bearing. Available. I continued reading. My hands were steady, my breathing was controlled. The deliberate, measured inhalation I used in hostile negotiations, when the other side was presenting numbers I knew were fabricated, and the only advantage I had was the appearance of calm. The shower upstairs continued its indifferent running. The house held its breath. I found the message that ended my marriage. It was from Michael to Evelyn, dated 9 months before Marcus was born. The language was different from the others, less guarded, almost tender in a way that made the tenderness itself feel like a blade. He wrote about fear, about what would happen if anyone found out, about the timing and whether the timing could be managed, and whether David will ever look at the boy and see what I see. The boy. I read the sentence 4 times. Each reading removed a layer of meaning until only the architecture remained. My best friend, writing to my wife 9 months before my son was born, wondering if I would ever look at Marcus and see what Michael saw. I closed the laptop, not gently. The click of the screen meeting the base was the loudest sound in the house, louder than the shower, louder than my own pulse hammering against the inside of my wrists. I sat in the chair that still smelled like my wife and pressed both palms flat against the desk and stared at the dark screen and waited for the world to reassemble itself into a shape I recognized. It didn't. The shower stopped. The pipes groaned once and went silent. I heard Evelyn's footsteps on the bathroom tile, bare feet on marble, the soft slap of someone who didn't know they were being listened to. The bathroom door opened. The bedroom door opened. Her footsteps descended the stairs, and I sat in the study and listened to her approach the way you listen to a verdict being read, already knowing the answer, unable to stop hearing it. She appeared in the doorway in her bathrobe, her hair wrapped in a towel, her face clean and open and pink from the hot water. She looked at me sitting at her desk, and something passed across her expression. Not guilt, not surprise, but the rapid, involuntary calculation of a woman assessing what had just become visible. David? Her voice was careful. What are you doing in here? I found the emails. 3 words. They left my mouth the way bullets leave a chamber, not with force, but with the mechanical inevitability of a mechanism that has already been triggered. I watched the words arrive. I watched her face receive them. Evelyn did not deny it. That was the thing I hadn't prepared for. Emotion. I had built a case, assembled evidence, constructed a narrative of betrayal with the methodical precision of a litigator preparing for trial, and the defendant didn't enter a plea. She stood in the doorway in her bathrobe, and her shoulders dropped, and her hand went to her collarbone, and her eyes, those cool blue-grey eyes that had looked at me across pillows and dinner tables and hospital rooms for a quarter of a century, filled with something that was either relief or resignation, and I could not tell the difference. How long? I asked. David. How many years, Evelyn? She exhaled. The sound was small, private, the sound of a woman setting down something she had been carrying for a very long time. She came into the study and sat in the chair across from the desk, the chair where clients sat, where subordinates sat, where people who were about to be told something they didn't want to hear were invited to make themselves comfortable. Before Marcus, she said. 2 words. They landed in the center of my chest with the precision of a surgeon's incision, not the wild tearing of unexpected pain, but the exact, deliberate parting of tissue that had been holding something together. Before Marcus. The affair had been going on since before my son was born, which meant my son, Marcus, with his unruly curls and his green hazel eyes and his gentle hands that painted canvases instead of signing contracts, might not be mine. I looked at Evelyn. She was crying. The tears moved down her face with the same unhurried precision that characterized everything she did. Even her grief was elegant, controlled, the weeping of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times that the actual performance was a kind of relief. I said nothing. There was nothing in the vocabulary I possessed that was adequate to the architecture of what had just collapsed. I sat in the chair and pressed my thumb into my palm until the joint cracked, and I breathed, in, out, with the mechanical regularity of a man who has discovered that breathing is a choice, and choices are the only thing left when everything involuntary has been taken away. Is Marcus mine? Evelyn's hand dropped from her collarbone to her lap. Her fingers twisted the belt of her bathrobe into a knot, then released it, then twisted it again. The towel on her head had begun to unravel, and a wet strand of honey-blonde hair fell across her forehead, and she didn't brush it away. "I don't know," she whispered. The words hung in the room like smoke. "I don't know. Not no. Not yes." The cruelest syllables in the language, 3 words that left the question open like a wound that could never fully close because it could never fully be diagnosed. I stood up. The chair rolled backward and hit the bookshelf behind the desk, and the impact knocked a framed photograph to the floor. Our wedding photo, the one where Evelyn is laughing and I am looking at her with the expression of a man who believes he has found the one thing in the world that will never betray him. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. I stepped over it and walked out of the study and down the hallway and through the kitchen and into the garage, where my car was parked next to her BMW with its oil stain on the concrete. And I sat behind the wheel and closed the door and pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and stayed there. I stayed there until the leather warmed against my skin and the garage went dark, and the only sound was the ticking of the engine I hadn't started, counting seconds the way a clock counts them in a room where something has just died. Emotion. "We need to talk about Evelyn," I said, and watched the smile leave Michael's face the way a tide pulls back from a shore. Not all at once, but in a slow, revealing recession that exposed what had always been underneath. His office was on the 43rd floor, one above mine, a detail that had never bothered me before and now felt like a map of the entire relationship. I had come in before his assistant arrived, before the building hummed with the oblivious industry of people who didn't know the walls were rotting. The room smelled of his cologne, that woody assertiveness, and the leather of the chairs he'd chosen himself, chairs designed to make visitors feel embraced and slightly smaller than the man behind the desk. Michael leaned back, the chair tipped to its comfortable limit. He steepled his fingers, a gesture I had seen him use in 1,000 negotiations, the body language of a man arranging his face into the position labeled concerned. "What about Evelyn?" he said. Casual, warm. The voice of a man who has been asked about the weather and is deciding how much detail to provide. I found the emails, the steepled fingers separated. His right hand moved to his cufflink, adjusting, not adjusting, fidgeting with the particular rhythm of a mechanism recalibrating. His green eyes held mine, and for the first time in 23 years of friendship, I saw them perform a calculation rather than a connection. "What emails?" he said. I didn't answer. I let the silence do what silence does in a room where both people know the truth, and one of them is still pretending. I had spent 2 days preparing for this conversation, 2 days in hotel rooms that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and old cigarettes, replaying every interaction, every dinner, every clapped shoulder and muttered brother, cataloguing the evidence not of what Michael had done but of how long I had let him do it. The silence extended. Michael's jaw tightened, a millimeter, no more. The involuntary contraction of a man whose charm has been made irrelevant by someone else's refusal to play. "David," he said, and his voice shifted register, lower, more careful. The voice you use when the casual approach has failed and you're moving to the next tool in the kit. "Whatever you think you, don't." One word. I delivered it the way I delivered closing arguments in board disputes. Flat, final, weighted with enough evidence that the single syllable landed like a gavel. Michael's mouth closed, his eyes narrowed, and something moved behind them. Not guilt, not yet, but the rapid sorting of a man determining which version of the truth would cause the least structural damage. "Okay," he said. He exhaled through his nose and leaned forward, elbows on the desk, palms open, the posture of surrender or its simulation. "Okay, how much do you know?" "Everything." "David, listen. I'm not here to listen, Michael. I'm here to confirm. Emotion univer." "How long?" He ran his hand through his hair, the silver-threaked dark hair he maintained with the same attention he gave to everything about his appearance, deliberately, strategically, as if every element of his physicality was a tool in a toolkit. His hand trembled at the temple. I noticed because I had never seen Michael Lawson's hands tremble. "It wasn't what you think," he said. "Tell me what it was." "It started," he stopped, repositioned. I watched him construct the sentence the way I had watched him construct 100 deal pitches, assembling the components, testing the load-bearing capacity of each word before committing to the structure. "It started as a mistake, a single time. We were both She was going through something, and I. How long, Michael? The repetition was surgical. I stripped the question of everything but its function. No emotion, no inflection, no invitation to fill the silence with context or excuse. Just the question. The same question, asked with the mechanical persistence of a machine that has been programmed to extract a single data point. His shoulders dropped. The expensive fabric of his shirt wrinkled in the places where his posture had been holding it taut. For the first time since I'd entered the room, Michael Lawson looked like a man who had run out of angles. A long time, he said quietly. Before Marcus. The question hit the air between us and stayed there. I watched it land. I watched the word Marcus, my son's name, or the name of the boy I had raised as my son, enter Michael's face through his eyes and travel inward, past the charm, past the calculation, past the professional machinery of a man who had spent his life managing other people's perception of him, until it reached something structural. Michael didn't answer. His silence was the confession, not the absence of words, the active, deliberate withholding of them. His green eyes, those warm, steady eyes that had looked at me across boardroom tables and bar tops and hospital waiting rooms, went flat. The warmth drained out of them the way warmth drains from a room when someone opens a window in winter, suddenly, completely, leaving you to realize that what you'd mistaken for heat had been performance. He didn't say no, that was the thing. In 23 years, Michael Lawson had never failed to answer a question. He had deflected, reframed, redirected, charmed, and occasionally lied with such fluency that the lie became indistinguishable from truth. But he had never simply not answered. The silence was an answer only a guilty man would give, because only a guilty man would understand that any arrangement of words, yes, no, I don't know, would cause more damage than the admission of knowing and choosing not to tell. He had known. All these years, he had known about Marcus, known that the boy might be his, known that I was building my life around a son who might not be mine, and he had said nothing. He had clapped me on the shoulder and called me brother and watched me raise a child whose jawline echoed his own, and he had kept quiet because keeping quiet was the only version of the story where Michael Lawson could remain in my life without consequences. I stood up. The chair scraped against the hardwood, a harsh, ugly sound in the padded silence of Michael's perfect office. He flinched. Michael Lawson flinched. The involuntary contraction traveled across his face and settled in his jaw, and for 1 second I saw him as he actually was. Not the magnetic, confident man I had admired and trusted, but a smaller figure, diminished, caught. A man whose entire identity was built on the assumption that the people around him would never look closely enough to see the scaffolding. David, he said. His voice cracked on my name, a small, audible fracture in the smooth surface he had maintained for 2 decades. Please, let me. I didn't hit him. I wanted to. The wanting was enormous. A physical pressure behind my sternum, in my fists, in the balls of my feet pressing against the floor. My body understood violence in a way my mind refused to permit, and for 3 seconds I stood beside the chair and let the wanting fill me the way water fills a container, completely, without air, without room for anything else. Then I walked out. I took the elevator to the parking garage. I sat in my car. I put the key in the ignition and gripped the steering wheel with both hands and pressed until my knuckles went white and the leather groaned against my palms and my forearms shook with the effort of holding onto something, anything that was solid. And then the rage came. Not the explosive, theatrical rage of men in movies who flip tables and break things. Something colder, deeper. A furnace igniting in a basement room I hadn't known existed, behind a door I had never opened because I believed that men like me, controlled men, reasonable men, men who solved problems with spreadsheets and strategy, didn't have rooms like that. I sat in the car and welcomed it. The heat, the clarity, the absolute annihilating focus of a man who has lost everything worth protecting and discovered, in the rubble, something that feels like the opposite of helplessness. I turned the key, emotion. The engine started, the garage echoed with the sound of the Mercedes coming alive, and I drove out into a city that looked exactly the same and would never look the same again. And the rage, cold, clean, mine, burned behind my ribs like a pilot light that would not go out. Sibili, amusant dalsa. There is a clarity that comes with being stripped of everything you believed was permanent. It arrives not as wisdom, but as geometry. A sudden ability to see the shapes of things because the furniture has been removed and the room is empty enough to measure. I moved into a 1-bedroom rental on West 74th Street on a Wednesday afternoon. and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Fresh latex paint laid over decades of older paint, and beneath that, the ghost scent of 100 previous tenants cooking, garlic, cumin, something fried, absorbed into plaster that no renovation could fully sterilize. The apartment was a cube, white walls reflecting the flat winter light from a single north-facing window, hardwood floors with the pre-sanded uniformity of wood that has never known bare feet or spilled wine, or the scuff marks of children playing. A kitchen with stainless steel appliances that hummed at a pitch just below hearing, the ambient frequency of machines waiting to be useful. I set my suitcase by the door and listened to the echo of it settling against the floorboard, a hollow, wooden sound, the sound of one object in a room designed for many. I had packed one bag, 3 suits, 7 shirts, the leather dop kit, a bottle of bourbon I'd bought at the liquor store on Amsterdam Avenue where the fluorescent lights turned everything the color of old newspaper, and the brass key to box 1147. I left behind the Patek Philippe my father had given me at 40, left it on the nightstand next to the bed I would no longer sleep in, its second hand continuing to count time inside a room whose clock, for me, had stopped. The first call came within hours. Richard Caldwell, board member, 20 years on the Harrington Capital Advisory Council. He called my personal cell at 4:37 p.m., which was unusual. Richard communicated by email, preferring the safe distance of written language to the messy intimacy of voice. The reception in the apartment was poor. His words arrived with a slight digital compression that made them sound as if they were being transmitted from underwater. "David, I've heard you're going through a difficult time." The words were careful, arranged, placed in sequence like tiles by a man following a pattern he hadn't designed. "We're all concerned. If you need time, the board would understand, not would support, not has your back." I turned the phrase in my mind the way I would turn a suspect clause in a contract, examining its load-bearing capacity, the language of preemptive distancing, the syntax of a man who has already been briefed on the narrative and is choosing his words to remain on the correct side of whatever comes next. "Who told you I was going through a difficult time, Richard?" A pause. Through the phone I could hear the distant clink of ice in a glass, his evening scotch, always at 4:30, always Macallan 18, always 3 cubes. "Evelyn called Margaret," he said. "She's worried about you, we all are." I thanked him and hung up, pressed the warm phone against the cold window glass, and watched condensation bloom around the screen's edges like a bruise forming in fast forward. The second call came at dinner, though dinner was a generous word for the Chinese takeout I ate from the container, sitting on the kitchen counter because I hadn't bought a chair yet, the plastic fork bending under the weight of MSG glazed noodles that tasted of cornstarch, and someone else's kitchen. Patricia, my sister-in-law, a woman who had never called me in 15 years of know-you-at-holidays acquaintance. "David, Evelyn is beside herself. She says you've been acting strangely since Thomas died. Working late, not sleeping, snapping at her. She's afraid you might be having some kind of..." The pause was surgical, selecting the word with the care of someone reading from a script they hadn't fully memorized. Episode. The clinical precision of that word, its implication of temporariness, of pathology, of a man whose behavior could be explained not by justified rage but by malfunction, sat in the cold air of my unfurnished apartment like a diagnosis delivered by a doctor who has never examined the patient. "Patricia, did Evelyn use that word?" "Exactly that word." "Well, I think she said, David, we're just worried." The worried army. Their ranks were filling, their talking points distributed, their concern manufactured and deployed with an efficiency I recognized from corporate crisis management. Control the narrative before the narrative controls you. I set the takeout container aside and opened the laptop I'd purchased that afternoon. New, clean, no synced accounts, no digital trail leading back to the house I had shared with a woman who was apparently managing my reputation with the same seamless proficiency she managed charity galas. The screen glowed white in the darkening apartment, the only light source besides the amber spillover from the street lamps 7 floors below. The calls had a pattern, the language had a pattern. Difficult time, concerned, episode, acting strangely. The words recurred with a frequency that was either coincidental or coordinated, and in my professional life, coincidence was a luxury I could no longer afford. Evelyn was building a case, not a legal case, a social one, a consensus, a version of reality in which David Harrington, grieving and unstable, had invented a crisis to explain behavior that his friends and family could attribute, with sympathetic headshakes and wineglass whispers, to the death of his father. She was not defending herself. She was constructing a world in which my response to her betrayal was itself the pathology. My phone buzzed against the countertop, the vibration amplified by the bare surface into something that sounded like a small, insistent animal trapped beneath the marble. A text from Michael. David, I know you're angry, I understand. But people are worried about you, brother. Whatever happened between us, you need to take care of yourself. I'm here if you need me, Mom, brother. The word tasted like copper. Whatever happened between us, phrased in the passive voice, abstracted into vagueness, as if the affair and the possible paternity fraud and the 2-decade betrayal were weather events that had occurred between them, rather than crimes committed against me. I turned off the phone, set it face down on the counter. Face down, like Evelyn's phone, like Michael's phone, like the phones of people who have something on their screens they would prefer you didn't see. The irony was not lost on me. The irony was the only thing that made me smile. I thought of Catherine Vale, a woman erased from a company she co-founded through legal machinery, NDAs, sealed settlements, forged amendments. My father had used documents. Evelyn and Michael were using something subtler, social architecture, the synchronized phone call campaign, the concerned text, the careful seeding of a narrative in which I was the problem and they were the worried community rallying around a broken man. Different tools, same blueprint. Outside the window, the city performed its nightly transformation. Office buildings switching from fluorescent white to amber, apartment windows flickering to life like individual cells in a vast organism that didn't know or care that one of its cells had gone dark. A siren passed, distant, Dopplering, someone else's emergency traveling through the winter air and leaving behind a silence that felt physical, that pressed against the walls of my empty apartment like a hand testing the integrity of a wall it intended to push through. I opened the laptop and began to type. Every date, every document, every discrepancy, every carefully manufactured lie. The shell company, the forged amendment, the E on Michael's phone. The salon receipt with its thermal paper truth that would fade if you held it too long. The word episode, spoken by 3 different mouths in 24 hours. The silence that had answered a question about Marcus. I mapped the architecture of my own destruction the way I would map any hostile acquisition. Systematically, dispassionately, with the understanding that the only way to dismantle a structure is to know exactly where the bolts are. At 2:17 a.m., the laptop battery died. The screen went dark, and I sat in the blackout of my empty apartment with the city's ambient glow painting the white walls in shades of amber and grey, and I felt something shift, not in my chest, not in my gut, but in the structural center of a man who had spent 52 years reacting to buildings other people had designed. I was done reacting. When the laptop powered back on, I searched for one name: Helen Park, litigation attorney, corporate fraud specialist, the woman who had dismantled the Trask Meridian case 3 years ago, a case that had made the front page of the journal because the defendant had been a Fortune 500 CEO who believed, right up until the verdict, that his money and his connections would protect him from the consequences of what he'd built. Emotion. I called her office and left a message. My voice in the recording sounded like a man I didn't recognize. Steady, precise, and cold enough to strip paint from walls. Numbness is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of too much feeling, compressed into a density that the nervous system cannot process, so it shuts down the receptors and leaves you floating in a silence that is not peace, but overload, the emotional equivalent of a circuit breaker, tripping because the current has exceeded what the wiring was designed to carry. I had been numb for 6 days. 6 days of sitting in a rental apartment that smelled of old paint and someone else's cooking, wearing the same 3 shirts in rotation, eating food I couldn't taste from containers I couldn't recall ordering. The rain hadn't stopped since Sunday. Grey, patient, administrative rain. The kind New York produces in November like a municipal service, washing the streets with a thoroughness that made the city look like a photograph developing in slow motion. It streaked the window beside my desk in rivulets that joined and separated and joined again, mapping and remapping the same surface without ever quite cleaning it. I sat at that desk at 3 a.m. with a bottle of bourbon that cost $11 and a legal pad that cost less than that, and I began to catalogue the lies. Not because I wanted to, because the numbness had developed a crack, a hairline fracture in its otherwise seamless surface, and through that crack, something was beginning to leak that was neither grief nor rage but something colder, the compulsion to understand, to count, to measure the exact dimensions of the structure that had been built around me while I stood inside it and called it home. I started with the vacations. Cabo, 2019. The villa on the cliff with the infinity pool that seemed to pour into the ocean. Michael had come alone, his girlfriend at the time had cancelled last minute, a detail I hadn't questioned because Michael's romantic life was a revolving door I had long stopped tracking. I thought of the photograph I had taken. Michael and Evelyn on the terrace at sunset, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something I hadn't heard because I was behind the camera. I had posted it to Facebook with the caption, "My two favorite people." I wrote it down, Cabo, Michael's arm, the caption, "The Lake House, 2017, a long weekend in August." Evelyn had gone up early to prepare the house, aired the sheets, stocked the kitchen, arranged flowers on every surface with the meticulous attention she gave to spaces she was about to perform in. Michael had driven up separately, arriving Friday evening, and I had come Saturday morning after a board meeting that ran late. They had one night alone in a house I owned, in beds I had paid for, using towels monogrammed with my initials. I wrote it down, Marcus's high school graduation, 2022. The ceremony at Dalton, the auditorium smelling of floor wax and lilies and the nervous perspiration of 318-year-olds in polyester gowns. Michael had sat beside me, not across from me, not in a different row, but directly beside me, close enough that his shoulder pressed against mine when he leaned forward to photograph Marcus walking across the stage. He had cheered, had gripped my arm and said, "You raised a hell of a kid, brother. You raised a hell of a kid." The bourbon burned going down, leaving a taste of varnished wood and the cheap sweetness of a distillery that prioritized volume over craft. I poured another measure and stared at the legal pad and felt the crack in the numbness widen. The business dinners, the birthday parties, the Tuesday evenings when Evelyn had her book club, a gathering I had never questioned, despite the fact that she rarely read, and the other members, when I asked about them, were described with a vagueness that should have constituted its own red flag. The Saturday mornings when Michael suggested brunch at places he had discovered, places that were, I now realized, chosen not for their food but for their distance from anyone who might know us. I wrote it all down, the legal pad filled with a handwriting I barely recognized as my own, smaller than usual, more compressed. The letters pressed so hard into the paper that the pen left grooves on the pages beneath. I was building a case against my own life, and the evidence was overwhelming. 20 years. The number sat on the page like a sentence, not the kind delivered in a courtroom, the kind you serve in a cell. 20 years of dinners and holidays and phone calls and ordinary domestic mornings that I had lived as truth and that had been, for two of the three people at the table, performance. 20 years during which I had turned my wedding ring and straightened my tie and pressed my thumb into my palm and told myself that I had built something real, something permanent, something that justified the 100-hour weeks and the missed recitals and the nights when I chose the spreadsheet over the sun because I believed, I genuinely, fundamentally believed, that the reward for building something was getting to keep it. Emotions. I put down the pen. The rain continued its patient work against the window. The bourbon sat in my stomach like a small, warm stone. The legal pad, 12 pages, front and back, contained the complete inventory of my deception, every date, every location, every remembered detail that, viewed through the lens of what I now knew, transformed from memory into evidence. I looked at the list and felt nothing. Then I looked at it again and felt everything, a tidal surge of grief and rage and shame that rose through the numbness like magma through a fault line, too hot to process, too massive to contain. I pressed my palms against the desk and breathed in through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, 6 counts. The breathing technique a therapist I saw once in my 30s had taught me for panic attacks I denied having. The surge passed. What remained was different. It was not numbness, it was not grief. It was a focused, quiet, dimensionless thing, a point of light at the end of a very long tunnel that I couldn't yet identify as hope or revenge or something that existed between the two, in a space that had no name because men like me were never supposed to need one. I picked up my phone. I had 12 missed calls. Evelyn, Patricia, Richard Caldwell. A number I didn't recognize that was probably another soldier in the worried army. I ignored all of them and opened my contacts. Helen Park. The voicemail I'd left 2 days ago had not been returned. I called again. At 3:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, I called a litigation attorney I had never met and left a second message, and my voice, steadier now, colder, shaped by 12 pages of evidence and 6 days of education in the mechanics of betrayal, said this: Miss Park, my name is David Harrington. I left a message on Monday that I suspect you haven't returned because you're vetting me. That's fine, I would do the same, but I want you to know that I'm not a man in crisis. Emotion. I'm a man with documentation. When you're ready, I have a case that will make Trask Meridian look like a parking ticket. There is a particular relief in sitting across from someone who does not need you to be okay. Helen Park did not ask me how I was feeling. She did not offer water or sympathy or the careful head tilt of concerned friends and worried relatives. She asked for the evidence, and I gave it to her, and she read it with the expression of a woman who had seen worse and charged by the hour. Her office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on Lexington Avenue, the kind of building that reflected the city back at itself and gave nothing away. The office itself smelled of printer toner, the warm chemical scent of documents being produced in volume, and black coffee that had been on the warmer so long it had developed the slightly burnt edge of coffee that exists to function rather than to please. The desk was a topography of casework, depositions in pale blue folders, affidavits in yellow, court filings in manila, stacked like geological strata, each layer representing some other person's disaster, some other intersection of trust and its violation. Every pile had a purpose. Every document was within arm's reach. Helen Park kept her weapons the way a carpenter keeps tools, organized by function, accessible by instinct. She was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, dark hair pulled into a knot that suggested efficiency rather than style, no jewelry except a watch, a steel shin, German-made, the face scratched from use, designed for precision rather than display. Her eyes were the color of good espresso, and they moved across my legal pad with the systematic focus of a woman who had been trained to see what was written between the lines. I had brought everything. The legal pad, its pages soft now from handling, the ink slightly smudged where my palm had rested during 6 days of obsessive review. The founding documents, yellowed and stiff, screenshots of the emails, printed in ink so cheap it smeared at a touch, the settlement agreement, the shell company records. Michael's text with its poisoned use of brother. I laid it out on her desk the way you lay out bones for an archaeologist. Here is what remains, tell me what lived. Helen read for 20 minutes. The only sounds were the whisper of turning pages, the distant murmur of traffic 14 floors below, and the intermittent click of the radiator beneath the window, an old building sound, pre-war heating, the kind of metallic ticking that meant the pipes were expanding and contracting with temperature changes, a building breathing. Let me make sure I understand the architecture, Helen said. She tapped my legal pad with a pen that clicked like a metronome, a black Pilot, the kind sold in drugstores, the kind a person uses when they've stopped caring what their pen says about them. You have a founding fraud. Your father stripped equity from his partner through a forged amendment. You have an active conspiracy, your wife and your business partner conducting an affair for 2 decades with a paternity question involving your son. And you have a defamation campaign, coordinated calls designed to establish a narrative of mental instability to undermine your credibility before you can act. I nodded. 3 fronts. She leaned back in her chair, a utilitarian thing, mesh back, no leather, purchased for lumbar support rather than impression. Corporate, domestic, reputational. You need to understand something, Mr. Harrington. You're not ahead, you're behind. They've been operating for 20 years and you've been aware for what, 2 weeks? In that time, they've already begun the process of isolating you. The concerned calls aren't sympathy, they're groundwork. When this goes to court, and it will, every person who received one of those calls becomes a witness to your instability. The fluorescent light hummed above us, a note I'd identify later as a B-flat, the vibrational signature of a 60 Hz ballast that no one had replaced because it still worked, and working was enough. The coffee maker in the corner gurgled its last dregs into a pot whose glass was permanently stained brown. Through the window behind her, the city's glass towers caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in sharp, cold angles that made the office feel like the inside of a prism. What do? I asked. Helen Park smiled for the first time since I'd walked in. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been asked the question she'd been waiting for, a controlled, professional expression that reached her eyes only far enough to signal competence, not compassion. "You stop playing defense." She stood and walked to the whiteboard, a dry erased surface covered in the ghost residue of previous cases, names and dates half erased, arrows connecting nodes in webs I couldn't decipher. She wiped a section clean with a cloth that smelled of isopropyl alcohol, sharp, clinical, the scent of erasure, and wrote 3 words in red marker, the letters angular and unambiguous, the ink squeaking against the board. "Catherine Vale, she's alive," Helen said. "She has to be. Your father's shell company was making monthly payments up until when? If those payments stopped at his death, we need to find her before your father's estate settles, because she is the key to the corporate fraud case. A living victim is a witness, a dead one is a filing." She wrote a second name beneath the first, Marcus Harrington. "The paternity question, you need a DNA test. Not through Evelyn, through your son directly. He's 22, he can consent without her knowledge or involvement. But you need to approach this carefully, because the moment Marcus knows, the emotional landscape of this entire situation changes." She paused, and the marker cap clicked against the board like a period at the end of a sentence. "Tense, not a data point, he's a person." I flinched. The involuntary contraction traveled from my jaw to my sternum, and I pressed my thumb into my palm, the joint cracking in the quiet office with a sound like a small branch breaking, and breathed the way I breathed when the numbers turned ugly. Deliberately, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, the mechanical rhythm of a man holding himself together by counting. Helen noticed. Her espresso eyes registered the flinch the way a seismograph registers a tremor. Without judgment, without reaction, with the simple, automatic precision of an instrument designed to document disturbance. "He's your son, Mr. Harrington, whatever the DNA says. You raised him. You taught him. You showed up." She paused. "The biology matters legally. It doesn't have to matter to you." The words landed in the fluorescent-lit silence like coins dropped into still water, precise, measured, their impact spreading outward in concentric rings. I looked at the whiteboard. 2 names in red on white. I thought of the legal pad, 12 pages of lies meticulously catalogued, and realized that Helen Park was doing something fundamentally different from what I had been doing. I had been building an inventory of what was taken. She was building a blueprint for taking it back. "The third front," she continued, writing. I flinched in Capital Board. Michael Lawson holds a partner position in a company built on fraud. If we can prove the founding agreement was forged, every decision made under that agreement, including Michael's partnership election, becomes reviewable. His seat on the board, his equity, his compensation package, all of it rests on a document that shouldn't exist. She capped the marker and turned to face me. The isopropyl alcohol smell still lingered, mixing with the printer toner and the burnt coffee into an olfactory signature I would forever associate with the moment my life shifted from falling apart to being deliberately taken apart. "Here's what I need from you. Documentation. Everything you have, digitized, organized, and backed up in triplicate outside your home, your office, and any device connected to your family's network. I need you to stop communicating with Evelyn and Michael except through counsel. And I need you to understand that the next 60 days will be the worst of your life, because we're going to dismantle everything you built before we can rebuild it on a foundation that's actually yours." I sat in the utilitarian chair in the efficient office on the 14th floor and felt something I hadn't felt since the night in the garage. The solid, unfamiliar weight of having someone in my corner who was not performing concern but deploying competence. "Where do we start?" I asked. Helen Park picked up the phone, a desk phone, wired, the kind that still existed in law offices because landlines couldn't be remotely accessed. Because in Helen Park's world, the wire between a phone and a wall was not outdated but deliberate. Emotion. "We start with Catherine Vale," she said, "because the woman your father erased is the one person who can help you prove that everything they took from you was never legitimately theirs to give. I have built my professional identity on the belief that I understood the machinery I operated, that the company bearing my family name was something I had earned through competence and inheritance, in that order. Sitting across from Catherine Vale in her modest apartment in Yonkers, watching her arrange documents on a table scarred with coffee rings and decades of solitary use, I understood that I hadn't earned anything. I had received stolen property and called it legacy. Helen had found her in 11 days. 11 days of process servers and database searches and retired SEC contacts who owed favors from the Trask Meridian case. The woman who had been erased from Harrington Capital's history was living 23 miles from its headquarters, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner whose vents pushed the warm chemical scent of perchloroethylene up through the floorboards. She was 71 years old, and her apartment smelled of Earl Grey tea and old paper, and the particular stillness of a life that had been made small by someone else's greed. I wondered when someone would come, she said when she opened the door. Her eyes were dark, sharp, undulled by age. The eyes of a woman who had spent 40 years watching for a knock that was either vindication or elimination. She looked at me and saw my father's face, and something moved behind her expression that I couldn't read. Not fear, not anger, but the complex recalibration of a woman encountering the son of the man who had destroyed her. Helen made the introductions with professional economy. Catherine led us into a living room organized with the clinical precision of a woman who had once managed portfolios, every object in its place, academic journals stacked by date on the bookshelf, a collection of ceramic mugs arranged by color on a shelf above the kitchen window, a framed Wharton diploma hung on the wall beside the bathroom door, as if she needed to see it every morning to remember who she had been before Thomas Harrington decided who she would become. The methodology was mine, Catherine said. She sat in an armchair upholstered in fabric that had faded from green to something closer to sage, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea whose steam curled upward and vanished. The algorithmic model, the risk assessment framework, 3 years of independent research. Your father provided the capital and the Rolodex. I provided the brain. She set the mug on a coaster, a ceramic coaster, hand-painted, cracked through the middle and glued back together, and opened a box that had been waiting on the floor beside her chair. Manila folders, notebooks, computer printouts from an era when printouts came in perforated sheets with tractor-feed edges. She had kept everything. In 1991, your father presented me with an amended agreement that reduced my equity from 37% to 4%, she continued. Her voice was steady, controlled, precise, the voice of a woman who had been rehearsing this testimony in her mind for 4 decades. He said the board had voted to restructure. He said it was standard. I signed because I trusted him. I was 31 years old, and I trusted a man who had looked me in the eye and told me we were partners. She paused. The tea steam had stopped rising. I didn't find out the signature on the original amendment was forged until 2 years later, when my lawyer, the one I could barely afford after the settlement, discovered that the document your father had shown me was not the same document filed with the state. There were 2 versions, one for me to sign under pressure, one for the record, pre-signed with a forgery of my name on a restructuring I never authorized. Helen was taking notes. Her pen moved across the legal pad with the efficient strokes of a woman building a case the way an engineer builds a bridge, load-bearing first, aesthetics never. She asked questions in a clipped, direct cadence. Dates, amounts, names of witnesses, the location of the original settlement file. I sat and listened and felt the last pillar of my professional identity dissolve because the methodology was hers, the engine that drove Harrington Capital, the proprietary algorithm that had generated billions in returns, the framework I had spent my career refining and deploying and taking credit for, belonged to the woman sitting in front of me in a faded armchair in a Yonkers apartment that smelled of tea and dry cleaning chemicals. Every quarterly report I had signed, every board presentation I had delivered, every handshake with every investor, every interview, every panel discussion where I had said the words, our methodology and our competitive advantage, all of it built on something stolen from a 31-year-old woman who had trusted the wrong man. The payments, I said. My voice sounded foreign, thin, stripped of the professional authority I had worn like armor for 28 years. The $12,000 a month. Catherine's mouth tightened. Silence money, your father's term, not mine. It was structured as a consulting fee through the shell company, Meridian Holdings. Taxable income. I declared every penny. She looked at me with an expression that contained no pity and no accusation, just the clear, flat assessment of a woman measuring the gap between what justice required and what life had actually delivered. I used it to survive. I couldn't work in finance after the NDA. Your father made sure of that. Every firm I approached received a call. I taught statistics at a community college for 12 years. I tutored high schoolers for 8. The room was very quiet. Through the floor I could hear the muffled thump and hiss of the dry cleaner's press below, the rhythm of fabric being heated and flattened and returned to a shape someone else had decided was correct. Helen looked up from her notes. "Dr. Vale, would you be willing to testify?" Catherine set her tea down. The mug made a small, precise click against the cracked coaster, and the sound was the loudest thing in the apartment. Louder than the dry cleaner, louder than the traffic outside, louder than the 40 years of silence that had preceded this moment. "I've been waiting to testify since 1993, she said. I looked at this woman, this brilliant, stolen woman who had invented the engine that made my family's name synonymous with financial excellence, and I thought of all the times I had stood in the Harrington Capital atrium beneath the brass letters of my father's name and felt pride. The pride was ash now. It tasted like the burnt residue at the bottom of Catherine's teacup, bitter, concentrated, the distilled remains of something that had once been warm. "I'm sorry," I said. The words were inadequate. I knew they were inadequate. They were 2 syllables offered to a woman who had lost 40 years of professional life, whose name had been surgically removed from the achievement that defined her, whose intellectual property had been laundered through corporate machinery until it wore another family's name, the way a stolen painting wears a forged signature. Catherine looked at me for a long time. The apartment ticked with the small sounds of an old building, radiator pipes, floorboards settling, the building's skeleton adjusting to temperatures it had been adjusting to for decades. "You're not the one who should be sorry," she said finally, "but you're the one who's here. That matters." We drove back to the city in Helen's car, a practical sedan that smelled of coffee lids and legal briefs. Helen drove the way she worked, precisely, without unnecessary motion, her eyes on the road with the same focused attention she gave to depositions. The Bronx River Parkway unwound before us in a grey ribbon of asphalt and bare trees, the November landscape stripped of its camouflage. "You have a witness," Helen said. "A credible, sympathetic, Wharton-educated witness with 40 years of documentation and 0 reason to lie." The fraud case just became winnable. "And what happens to the company?" I asked. The question tasted like the bourbon I hadn't touched in 3 days. If the founding agreement is fraudulent, every subsequent governance action is reviewable. Michael's partnership, the board composition, potentially even the estate distribution. She glanced at me. "Everything you thought you inherited is built on a document that shouldn't exist, which means everything they're trying to take from you was never legitimately theirs to give, or yours to keep, or mine to keep." I turned my wedding ring. The platinum was warm from my skin, and for the first time the turning felt different, not nervous habit but deliberate motion, the slow rotation of a man removing something he had been wearing so long it had become part of the anatomy. "Then we start from 0, I said. Helen nodded. The car moved through the November afternoon, and the city rose ahead of us in its familiar skyline of glass and steel, and I looked at it the way you look at a house you grew up in after learning it was built on someone else's land. With recognition, with grief, with the quiet understanding that the only honest thing left to do is give it back. Emotion. There is a moment in every demolition when the building stops falling and the dust begins to settle, and you can see for the first time the footprint of what was there, the foundation lines, the anchor points, the places where the weight was carried. I stood in the wreckage of my life and began for the first time to design something on purpose. Helen's conference room at midnight. The overhead fluorescents switched off. I had asked her to kill them, preferring the desk lamp's warm cone of light to the institutional glare that made every document look like an autopsy report. The table was covered in 2 parallel architectures of fraud, arranged chronologically, my father's on the left, Michael's on the right. The paper smelled of toner and old filing cabinets and the faintly metallic scent of staples oxidizing in documents that had been stored for decades. I stood at the whiteboard with a red marker in my hand. The xylene fumes were sharp, chemical, clarifying, the kind of scent that cuts through exhaustion the way cold water cuts through sleep. I drew a line down the center of the board and wrote 2 words: restore, remove. Under restore, I listed Catherine Vale's name. Under remove, Michael Lawson's. The act of writing Michael's name felt different than I expected. Not vengeful, not satisfying. It felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying so long that my muscles had shaped themselves around it. 23 years of friendship, or what I had called friendship, what I had needed to be friendship, because the alternative was admitting that the man I trusted most had been studying me the way a locksmith studies a lock, not to protect it, but to learn its weaknesses. That was the deeper cut. Not the sex. The sex was a wound, temporal, survivable, the betrayal of skin and sheets and the particular intimacy of a body you believed was sanctuary. But the pattern, the 23-year pattern of a man who had positioned himself as indispensable not out of affection but out of access, that was the injury that would scar, because it meant every genuine moment I remembered between us was contaminated, not erased, worse, rendered ambiguous. Every late-night confessional over bourbon, every holiday where he sat at my table and carved my turkey and looked at my wife across the candles. Ambiguity was the cruelest weapon, and Michael had been wielding it my entire adult life. "Walk me through it," Helen said. She was sitting at the far end of the table, her steel shin catching the lamplight, a mug of coffee in her hand that had gone cold an hour ago, the surface developing that oily film that forms when heat abandons liquid. Catherine Vale was defrauded of her equity and her intellectual property, I said. My father is dead. He can't be held accountable. Emotion. But the estate can. I want to begin a restitution process, a formal acknowledgement of her contribution, a financial settlement that reflects the actual value of what was taken, and a public restoration of her name in the company records. Helen's espresso eyes assessed me. That's going to cost you, not just money, reputation, legacy, the Harrington name. The Harrington name is a forgery, I said. The words tasted clean, precise and true, and stripped of the varnish I had been applying to my family's story for my entire career. It was built on someone else's work. Restoring Catherine's name isn't charity, it's accuracy. It's the first honest thing a Harrington will have done in 40 years. I heard my own voice and didn't recognize it. Not the pitch or the timbre, those were the same, but the quality. Something had changed in the way I constructed sentences. The business metaphors were gone. The careful, measured cadences I had used my whole life to sound authoritative. Gone. What remained was simpler, harder. The language of a man who had stopped performing competence and started telling the truth. Helen set her mug down, the ceramic clicking against the table with the small, decisive contact of an object placed with intention, and pulled her laptop forward. I've already started on Michael's financials. The screen's blue-white glow reflected in her watch face. Your Harrington Capital CFO filed a discrepancy report 17 months ago regarding an internal account that was supposed to be inactive. It was routed to Michael's office for review. The review never happened. The file was closed with a notation, administrative error. She turned the screen toward me. The spreadsheet showed a series of transfers, small, irregular amounts, never exceeding 50,000, routed between accounts whose addresses resolved to a single mailbox in Stamford, Connecticut. I knew the pattern. I had seen it in acquisition targets, in companies whose executives had been siphoning value for years beneath the surface of quarterly reports. Michael had set up a shadow structure, 3 to 4 million over 5 years, not enough to sink the company, just enough to fund the life of a man who believed he deserved everything he took. Entitlement is structural. If it exists in one dimension of a man's life, if he sleeps in his partner's bed and raises his partner's child and calls his partner brother while calculating the angle of approach, it exists in all of them. The money was a symptom. Michael Lawson was the disease. Timeline, Helen said. Catherine's restitution. I file a demand letter to the Harrington estate within 10 days. Forensic accountants will value her methodology's contribution to total returns. Conservatively, north of 50 million. 50 million. More than half of what I had inherited. More than the house, the investments, the accumulated comfort of a life I had built, or thought I had built, dollar by dollar, handshake by handshake, in the image of a father I had believed was honest. I did not flinch. I was done flinching. I had spent 52 years comfortable, and comfort had built me a life that turned out to be someone else's performance. I was ready to be something other than comfortable. Michael, we present the evidence to the independent directors, quietly, under NDA, and give them a choice: support his removal, or become complicit in fraud they now know about. And the paternity question. Helen's pen stopped moving. The silence was brief, 3 seconds, maybe 4, but I felt it the way you feel the gap between a lightning flash and its thunder. a measure of distance, of how far the impact had to travel before it arrived. "That's not legal strategy," she said. "That's a conversation with your son, my son." The phrase landed differently now, not with the automatic certainty of 22 years of fatherhood, but with the tentative, fragile weight of something I was choosing to believe rather than something I knew. And I realized that this willingness to choose the belief even when the evidence was uncertain, was what fatherhood had always been. Not biology, not certainty. The daily deliberate choice to show up for a person you have decided belongs to you, regardless of any document or DNA or the machinations of people who never asked your permission before rearranging your life. "I'll talk to Marcus," I said, "after the board vote, after Catherine is restored. I want him to meet me as the man who made it right, not the man still in the middle of making it wrong." Helen gathered her files. The papers whispered against each other, the sound of a demolition plan being assembled, document by document, into something that looked for the first time like a blueprint. I turned off the desk lamp. The room went dark except for the grey pre-dawn light seeping through the window, the first thin line of morning separating itself from the night. I stood in that borderline illumination, the space between the man I had been and the man I was choosing to become, and felt something I hadn't felt since my father's funeral. Not happiness, not even hope, but purpose, emotion. Clean, unencumbered, stripped to the studs purpose. The purpose of a man who had lost everything he didn't build and was ready, finally, to build something that was actually his, emotion. I had imagined this conversation 100 times in my rental apartment, rehearsing it the way trial lawyers rehearse closings, testing every word for weight, every pause for pressure, every silence for the information it would extract. But standing in my own kitchen, facing the woman I had loved for 25 years across the island where she had poured my coffee with the receipt on the counter, I discovered that preparation and readiness are not the same thing. The house smelled like home, lemon furniture polish, jasmine perfume in the curtains, not fresh but embedded, the olfactory residue of 1,000 mornings. The thermostat held at 72 degrees as always, because Evelyn believed that comfort was something you calibrated rather than felt. The afternoon light came through the dining room windows at the angle I had always loved, painting the mahogany table in warm stripes that made everything it touched look golden and permanent. I set the folder on that table, 47 pages, every page a nail. Evelyn sat across from me in the chair where she always sat, the one closest to the kitchen, the one that gave her a line of sight to the front door, the stove, and the hallway leading upstairs, her territory. She was dressed as if for a meeting, cream blouse, gold earrings, lipstick applied with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was armor. She had known this was coming, perhaps not the specifics, but the shape of it, the way animals sense weather before it arrives. "I know about Catherine Vale," I said. Evelyn's hands were folded on the table. They did not move. "I know about the founding fraud, the forged amendment, the monthly payments through Meridian Holdings. I know that every dollar we've lived on, every board meeting I've attended, every handshake I've exchanged as the CEO of a company bearing my family's name, all of it was built on intellectual property my father stole from a woman he then erased from the record." She blinked. Once. The gesture was small, controlled, the involuntary minimum of a woman who had spent decades managing her responses the way she managed her household, with absolute economy. "David, let me finish." I opened the folder. The first photograph was the email chain. I turned it toward her the way a prosecutor presents evidence. Face up, centered, inescapable. "I know about you and Michael. I've known for 3 weeks. I've read the emails going back 12 years, though I suspect it goes back further. I've documented the timeline. I've identified the locations. I've cross-referenced your alibis with credit card records, and 17 of them don't hold." Evelyn looked at the photograph. Her jaw tightened, a millimeter, the same involuntary contraction I had seen in Michael's office, and her hand moved to her collarbone. That gesture, the one I had been cataloguing since the morning after my father's funeral, the tell I had never identified until a week ago, when I understood that a hand going to the hollow of a throat is the body's way of protecting the voice before it betrays the mind. "The question I need to ask you," I said, "is the one you already know I'm going to ask." Her eyes met mine. Blue-gray, steady, the eyes I had looked into across pillows and delivery rooms and hospital bedsides and the 1,000 ordinary mornings that constitute the architecture of a marriage. They were the same eyes. They had always been these eyes. watching, calculating, assembling the geometry of the next moment before it arrived. Is Marcus my son? The question left me and entered the room and settled on the mahogany table between us like an object with weight and mass, something physical, something that displaced the air and changed the temperature and made the grandfather clock's ticking suddenly audible in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds before. Evelyn's composure broke, not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of a woman performing remorse, but structurally, the way a dam breaks, a small fissure first, a seepage, and then the architecture failing in a sequence that is both inevitable and irreversible. Her shoulders dropped, her hands separated. The careful posture she had maintained since I entered the room dissolved, and what remained was smaller, a woman sitting in a chair that was suddenly too large, in a house that was suddenly someone else's. I don't know, she whispered. The same 3 words she had said the night I found the emails, but this time they carried a different quality, not shock but exhaustion, the sound of a woman who has been carrying a lie so long that setting it down feels like setting down a bone. That's not good enough, Evelyn. It's the truth. Her voice cracked on the second word. A tear formed at the corner of her left eye and traveled down her cheek with the same unhurried precision that characterized everything she did. Even in collapse, her grief moved with discipline. I wanted him to be yours. I've always wanted him to be yours. What you wanted doesn't change what might be true. I said it without cruelty. I said it the way Helen Park would have said it, with precision, not malice. But the words landed anyway, and I watched them land, and I felt the cost of wielding truth as a weapon. It cuts the person holding it as deeply as the person receiving it. The surgeon's hands are steady, but the surgeon bleeds. Here's what's going to happen, I said. I closed the folder. The sound of the cardboard cover meeting the table was crisp, final, administrative, the sound of a chapter ending. I'm filing for divorce. Helen Park is handling it. The financial restructuring will account for Catherine Vale's restitution, which means the estate will be significantly reduced before any marital settlement is calculated. You should get your own attorney. Evelyn wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, a gesture so unlike her, so stripped of her usual elegance, that it hurt more than anything she had said. This was the woman beneath the woman, the 23-year-old I had married, who had bitten her nails and laughed too loud and hadn't yet learned that vulnerability was a thing to be managed rather than expressed. About Michael, I continued. I'm presenting evidence of his financial misconduct to the board. His partnership will be terminated. His equity will be forfeit. I'm not asking for your help with this. I'm telling you it's happening. What I am offering you is a choice. She looked up. The tear track on her cheek caught the afternoon light. You can cooperate with the process, testify to the timeline of the affair, provide any communication records you have, and the divorce will be handled privately, cleanly, with whatever dignity remains. Or you can align yourself with Michael, and everything becomes public. The affair, the paternity question, the coordinated campaign to frame me as unstable, all of it. The grandfather clock ticked. Outside, a car passed on the street. A sound so ordinary, so suburban, so fundamentally indifferent to the demolition occurring inside this dining room, that I felt a sudden, disorienting nostalgia for the version of my life in which a passing car was the most interesting thing that happened on a Tuesday afternoon. You've become someone I don't recognize, Evelyn said. The words were intended to wound. I received them the way Helen had taught me to receive testimony, without reacting, without defending, letting the statement enter the record and speak for itself. No, I said. I've become someone you never bothered to know. There's a difference. I picked up the folder. The mahogany table, stripped of its evidence, gleamed in the afternoon light. Empty, polished, reflecting the ceiling in its dark surface the way a lake reflects a sky it cannot touch. I walked to the front door. My hand found the brass knob, and the metal was cool against my palm. The same knob I had turned 10,000 times, coming home from work, coming home from dinners, coming home to a life I believed was waiting for me because it wanted to, not because it was performing. I opened the door. The November air rushed in, cold, clean, carrying the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and I stepped across the threshold of the house I would never sleep in again, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, but grief. Pure, undiluted, the grief of a man who has just performed the most necessary surgery of his life and can feel in the trembling of his own hands exactly how much of himself he cut away to do it. Emotion. I had expected to feel something. Satisfaction, perhaps. The clean, cold pleasure of a mechanism executing its function. I had built this moment the way I built everything, with precision, with strategy, with the careful allocation of resources to outcome. But as the board filed in and took their seats and the fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent note above us, I felt something I hadn't budgeted for, the weight of what I was about to destroy. The boardroom occupied the 44th floor, one above Michael's office, two above mine, and its floor-to-ceiling windows looked over the city with the detached omniscience of a surveillance system. The table was 20 feet of polished walnut that reflected the skyline in its dark surface, and I had sat at it for 28 years without ever once thinking of it as a weapon. The room smelled of leather chairs warmed by wool-suited bodies, the metallic edge of nervous perspiration beneath cologne, and the particular ozone hum of the presentation screen that Helen had commandeered at 8:45. Michael arrived at 9:01. 3 minutes early, his standard tactic, arriving before the agenda could be set, occupying the space the way he occupied every room, with the assumption that it was already his. He wore the navy suit he reserved for board meetings, the one that cost $4,000 and fit him like the promise of competency, and he sat at the head of the table as if the head was still his to claim. He looked at me across the walnut surface and smiled. Warm, steady, the smile of a man who believed that charisma was a form of armor. Helen distributed the folders at 9:04, 12 folders, one for each board member, one for the corporate secretary, and one for the court reporter she had hired without telling anyone in advance. The court reporter's presence landed on Michael's expression the way a stone lands in still water, a single point of impact, then concentric ripples spreading outward through the muscles of his face, rearranging everything. "Before we begin," Michael said, standing before anyone had asked him to, "I want the record to show that David has been under considerable personal stress." "Sit down, Michael." My voice was flat. Not angry, not authoritative, just the sound of a man who had stopped performing and started operating. "Miss Park." Helen stood. She was wearing black, a deliberate choice, I suspected, the same way a surgeon wears scrubs, not for aesthetics but for function, for the signal it sends to the room that what is about to happen is medical rather than theatrical. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helen said, "what you'll find in your folders is a summary of a forensic audit covering the last 7 years of Michael Lawson's financial activity within Harrington Capital." She clicked the presentation remote. The screen behind her bloomed with numbers, line items, account transfers, routing codes. On page 3, you'll see a series of unauthorized transfers totaling approximately $3.7 million, routed through subsidiary accounts that were supposed to be inactive, to an external mailbox in Stamford, Connecticut, registered to a shell entity controlled by Mr. Lawson. The room went quiet. The particular quiet of 12 people simultaneously recalculating their relationship to the man at the head of the table. Michael's smile persisted for exactly 4 more seconds. I counted them the way you count the delay between lightning and thunder, each second representing the distance between the impact and the man it was traveling toward. Then the smile left his face, and what replaced it was something I had never seen in 23 years, the naked machinery of a mind stripped of its performance layer. Tense chime first. "This is absurd," he said, spreading his hands palm up on the table, the gesture of openness, the body language of a man with nothing to hide. But his cufflinks caught the light as his wrists turned, and I noticed his fingers were trembling. "David, you know me. You know my commitment to this company. These numbers they're clearly the result of some kind of—" "Page 7, Helen said, clicking to the next slide. "Mr. Lawson's personal trading account shows 17 instances of trades executed within 48 hours of confidential board discussions regarding acquisition targets. The statistical probability of coincidence is approximately 1 in 14,000. Charm died. Anger arrived." Michael stood again. His chair rolled backward and struck the credenza behind him. The same credenza where his bourbon sat, the Blantons he poured for celebratory toasts, offered to board members with the casual generosity of a man who wanted you to know he could afford to share. "This is a hit job," he said. His voice had risen by a third, the careful modulated baritone, giving way to something rawer, something that had teeth. "David is going through a personal crisis, and he's using company resources to—" "The evidence was gathered independently by Park and Kendrick," Helen said. "At Mr. Harrington's personal expense, no company resources were utilized." Michael looked around the table. I watched him scan each face, reading the room the way he had always read rooms, searching for allies, for uncertainty, for the cracks where charm could be poured like grout to hold the structure together. He found none. The faces were closed, the folders were open. "David," he turned to me. His green eyes, the eyes that had looked at me with warmth and loyalty and the particular intensity of a man who had made himself indispensable, were bright with something I recognized from hostile negotiations, the calculation of a man determining his last available exit. We built this together. 23 years, whatever is happening between us personally, brother, don't do this. Brother. The word arrived like a hand reaching for my arm at the edge of a cliff. The same hand, the same grip, the same warmth that had held me up 1,000 times and was now, I understood, the hand of a man who had been standing behind me not to catch me, but to measure the distance to the ground. Self? I'm not doing anything, Michael, I said. The board is doing it. I've recused myself from the vote. The vote was 11-0. Michael abstained, or rather his vote was nullified by the conflict of interest Helen had entered into the record. The resolution read, immediate termination of Michael Lawson from all positions, pending full forensic review. Michael stood. He buttoned his jacket, the $4,000 jacket, the armor he had worn into this room believing it would protect him, and looked at me one final time. His jaw was set. His eyes were dry. Whatever calculation was running behind them had concluded, and the result was a silence that said everything his mouth no longer could. He walked out. I watched him through the glass wall of the boardroom, moving down the corridor toward the elevator, his stride controlled, his shoulders level, performing dignity the way a man performs dignity when the audience is watching through transparent walls. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. The doors closed. The boardroom erupted into the low murmur of people processing what they had just witnessed, shuffling papers, exchanging glances, the sibilant whisper of consensual exhale. Helen was already packing her briefcase, her movements efficient, a soldier cleaning her weapon after deployment. I sat at the walnut table and waited for the satisfaction. It didn't come. What came instead was a hollow, ringing emptiness, the acoustic signature of a room from which something large has been removed. Not relief, not vindication, the particular absence that follows a detonation. The blast is over, the debris is falling, and you're standing in the crater wondering why the victory feels exactly like the destruction. I had won. I had dismantled Michael Lawson with the same methodical precision I had used to build quarterly reports and acquisition strategies, and the careful, competent life of a man who believed that if you controlled the process, you controlled the outcome. And the outcome was this. An empty chair at the head of a table in a company built on fraud, and a man walking away through glass walls, and the taste of ash in my mouth where triumph was supposed to be. I turned my wedding ring. Then I stopped turning it. Then I took it off and set it on the walnut table, and the small platinum circle sat there reflecting the fluorescent light like a zero, a perfect polished nothing at the center of everything I had dismantled. Emotion. I had won the boardroom. I had delivered truth to my wife in precisely measured doses. I had spent 6 weeks operating as a machine, and now I was parked outside my son's apartment in Brooklyn. The leather seat cold against my back, my breath ghosting against the windshield in dissolving clouds, unable to open the car door, because the one truth I could not weaponize was the one that lived in his face every time he smiled. The Brooklyn Bridge had been illuminated against the November sky, its cables catching the last afternoon light like the strings of an instrument played by the wind. Marcus lived in a Bushwick walk-up, 4th floor, the kind of building where each landing carried its own scent signature, huming and fried plantain on the 1st floor, lavender detergent on the 2nd, turpentine and linseed on the 3rd, and by the 4th, the unmistakable olfactory fingerprint of my son. Cedar incense, oil paint, and the particular warmth of cheap radiators working overtime against drafty windows. I climbed the stairs. The banister was iron, cold enough to sting my palm. The treads creaked in a sequence I imagined Marcus knew by heart. The music of Coming Home played in minor key by old wood and older nails. At the 4th floor, I knocked, and the sound of my knuckles against the painted steel door was the loneliest sound I had ever made. Marcus opened the door in a paint-stained flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, cadmium yellow smeared along his left forearm. And when he saw me, his face did the thing it had done since he was 7 years old. It opened, unguarded, unedited, the transparency of a person who had never learned to protect his face from his feelings. "Dad!" He pulled me into a hug. His arms went around my shoulders with the grip of a young man whose world was shifting, a grip that asks for stability by providing it. He smelled of turpentine and coffee and the same laundry detergent I had always used, which he had never stopped buying, and I held on to him in the narrow doorway. the hallway fluorescent buzzing above us, a neighbor's television murmuring through cinder block, and pressed my face into his shoulder and breathed. Green hazel eyes, Michael's jawline, my height, Evelyn's long-fingered hands, holding paintbrushes the way hers held fountain pens. I looked at my son and saw the mosaic of everyone who might have made him, and I loved him with a ferocity that had nothing to do with origin and everything to do with 22 years of 3 a.m. fevers and first-day photographs and the quiet, devastating pride of watching a human being become himself. The apartment was beautiful chaos, canvases stacked against walls, a 6-foot study in blues and greys propped beside the kitchen like the interior of a cloud. He poured coffee into mismatched mugs, one from MoMA, one chipped and reading World's Okayest Dad, from a French press crusted with grounds that had calcified into geological strata. The coffee tasted of boiled pencils and good intentions. The mug was warm against my palms, and the warmth traveled through my hands into my wrists and settled behind my sternum, and I drank it and tasted love. Marcus, I need to tell you some things. He sat on the edge of his bed, the studio's only seating besides a stool splattered with Prussian blue, and pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them. 22 years old. And when he curled like that, he was 7 again, sitting in my lap while I read to him, his body folding into the smallest possible shape because smaller meant safer. Your mother and I are getting a divorce. The words settled onto every surface the way paint dust settles when you sand a canvas. Unavoidable, permanent. The afternoon light caught his profile, the line of his jaw, the shadow beneath his cheekbone, and his face closed. Emotion. Slowly, carefully, the way a person closes a door when they need to keep what's behind it from getting out. Is it because of grandpa's, the company stuff? It's complicated. Some of it is about the company, some of it is about, I paused. The truth pressed against my teeth. Michael. The affair, the paternity, the entire architecture of deception that had surrounded this boy his whole life. I felt the words arrange themselves in my mouth the way evidence arranges itself in a folder, ordered, devastating, ready. I did not say them. I made my choice, love over truth. Not because truth didn't matter, because some truths belong to the person they're about, and Marcus's biology was not my evidence to present. It was a question he would have to ask himself in his own time when the ground felt solid enough. Some of it is about things I need to fix, I said. Things your grandfather did that were wrong. Michael Lawson has been removed from the company. Michael. His green hazel eyes, genetics shuffling the deck into a color entirely his own, widened. Uncle Michael? Uncle Michael. The endearment hit me like a fist to the sternum. 22 years of Uncle Michael and birthday presents and the constant proximity of a man who might have been the biological father of the boy calling him uncle. Yes, I said, Uncle Michael. Marcus was quiet. The cedar incense had burned down to a stub, its last thread of smoke curling toward the water-stained ceiling. The coffee cooled in our mugs. Outside, Bushwick performed its evening transition. A car alarm, someone's bachata through an open window, the distant hammer of a construction project that worked late because New York never stopped building, even when the people inside it were falling apart. Are you okay, Dad? The question broke me, not the fraud, emotion. Not the affair, not the board vote and the 47-page folder and the clinical precision with which I had dismantled the 2 people I trusted most. This simple question from a 22-year-old in a paint-stained flannel who had poured me terrible coffee in a mug that said World's Okayest Dad. This was the thing that cracked the architecture wide open. I pressed my thumb into my palm. The joint didn't crack. The gesture was empty, the habit without the release, the body reaching for its mechanism and finding it had been worn smooth by overuse, like a key turned so many times the teeth have flattened. I'm going to be, I said. And I meant it the way only a man who has lost everything can mean it. Not as prediction, but as decision. A choice, like fatherhood. A daily, deliberate act of believing that the man you're becoming is worth the one you destroyed. Marcus unfolded himself from the bed and crossed the small apartment. 3 steps, that was all. 3 steps across paint-splattered floorboards that bore the evidence of a life lived in color, and put his arms around me. I held my son, my son, my son, biology be damned, and felt his heartbeat against my chest through 2 layers of paint-scented cotton, steady and unhurried, the rhythm of a young man who still believed that the people he loved would stay. The Bushwick evening darkened around us. Streetlights flickered on in their sodium orange sequence. The construction hammer fell silent. The apartment held us in its smell of linseed and cedar and terrible coffee, and the small warmth of a radiator clicking its patient metallic pulse against the November cold. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It buzzed again. Marcus pulled back. "You should get that." I looked at the screen. Helen Park. A text, 3 words long. Catherine found something. I stared at the message. The fluorescent kitchen light hummed above us. Marcus was watching me with those green hazel eyes, open, trusting, waiting for me to demonstrate that the man I was becoming was the kind who answered the phone and came back. "I have to make a call," I said, "but I'm coming back." Emotion. I'm always coming back. Marcus nodded. He picked up his paintbrush, the gesture automatic, the reflex of a young man who processed the world through color, and turned back to his canvas, and I stepped into the stairwell and pressed the phone to my ear and descended into whatever Catherine Vale had unearthed from the ruins of my father's legacy, carrying my son's heartbeat in my chest like a compass pointing toward the only north that mattered: emotion. What Catherine Vale had found, the final piece, the document Helen's text had summoned me from Marcus's apartment to see, was a second trust, hidden inside the shell company structure like a confession sealed in an envelope. It contained an additional 37% equity stake, frozen since 1991. My father had not merely stolen Catherine's share. He had preserved it, locked it away in legal amber, as if some part of him had always known that the theft would one day need to be returned, and he had wanted the exact amount to be available when the reckoning came. This changed everything, and it changed nothing, because the fraud remained a fraud, the theft remained a theft, and the man who had committed both was beyond the reach of any courtroom. But it gave me what I needed for the final act, a mechanism for restoration that was already built into the architecture of my father's deception, waiting like a loaded gun with the safety off, pointed at his own legacy. The press conference was held in the Harrington Capital atrium at 10 a.m. on a Thursday in December. The space was designed for pageantry, 40-foot ceilings of glass and steel, the winter sun pouring through the east wall in wide white columns that made the marble floor glow like the surface of a frozen lake. The brass letters of Harrington Capital hung above the entrance, catching light that turned them golden, and I stood at the podium Helen had positioned directly beneath them, with the deliberate staging of a woman who understood that symbols matter as much as evidence. 30 journalists, 12 cameras, the smell of coffee from the catering table mixing with the building's permanent scent of climate-controlled air and polished stone. Catherine Vale sat in the front row, the first time she had been inside this building since 1991, wearing a dark blue blazer and an expression I had seen once before, on the faces of people acquitted after wrongful convictions, not joy, but the stunned, fragile disbelief of justice arriving decades after you stopped believing it would. I removed my father's portrait from the wall myself. Helen had suggested having it done beforehand, less theatrical, she said, with the professional restraint of a woman who preferred evidence to gesture. But I wanted this to be real. I wanted it witnessed. I stepped away from the podium, crossed the marble floor, my footsteps echoing in the silence of 30 journalists holding their breath, and lifted the oil painting from its mount. The canvas was heavier than I expected. The frame's gilt edge dug into my fingers. My father's painted eyes looked at me with the steady, patriarchal certainty of a man who had been rendered in oils by an artist paid to make him look 10 years younger and fundamentally trustworthy. I set the portrait face down on the marble floor. The frame made a sound, not a crash, but a firm, definitive contact of gilded wood against stone that echoed through the atrium like a period at the end of a sentence 40 years long. I returned to the podium. The microphones caught the slight tremor in my breath. "My name is David Harrington," I said, "and I am here to correct a 40-year lie." The room was very still. The cameras hummed their quiet mechanical hum. The winter light shifted by a degree as a cloud passed, and the atrium's golden quality dimmed to silver before returning, the building itself breathing. In 1986, Catherine Vale, Ph.D., developed the proprietary trading methodology that became the foundation of Harrington Capital. She was my father's equal partner, holding 37% equity to his 35%. In 1991, my father executed a forged amendment that stripped Dr. Vale of her entire stake, erased her name from the company's records, and buried her contribution under a settlement agreement designed to ensure she would never be heard from. I paused. The silence was complete. The the controlled, attentive silence of a room that knows it is hearing something that cannot be unheard. Dr. Vale is here today. I looked at her. She looked back with those sharp, dark eyes that had seen this day coming for 4 decades, and I watched her jaw tighten and her hands grip the arms of her chair and her back straighten with the precise, dignified posture of a woman who had waited longer than anyone should have to wait to hear her own name spoken aloud in the building she had helped build. Effective immediately, I continued, the Harrington Capital Board has voted to restore Dr. Vale's equity position, 37%, drawn from the trust my father established, along with a full public acknowledgement of her foundational contribution to the company's methodology and success. Her name will be added to the corporate charter. The brass letters above this entrance will be supplemented with a designation that reflects the truth: Harrington Vale Capital. A murmur moved through the room, the collective sound of 30 people processing a revelation that rearranged the narrative of a company worth $2.3 billion. One journalist's pen dropped. The sound, a small plastic click against the marble, was absurdly clear. Catherine stood. She stood the way people stand when the ground they're on has finally stopped shifting. Slowly, with the careful deliberation of a woman testing whether this moment would hold her weight, she turned to face the cameras, and her expression was not the theatrical emotion of a prepared statement, but the raw, unmanaged truth of a 71-year-old woman who had been made small by a powerful man and had survived long enough to be made visible again. She didn't speak. The cameras captured her silence, the eloquent, devastating silence of presence, of simply being in the room, standing upright after 40 years of being absent. I watched her, and I felt the demolition complete itself. Every brass letter I had inherited, every quarterly report with my name on it, every board meeting, every handshake, every year of my career, all of it resting on a foundation I had now publicly acknowledged, was stolen. The Harrington name was no longer mine alone to carry, because it had never been mine alone to claim. Helen caught my eye from the side of the room. She gave a single nod, not approval, not congratulations, but the acknowledgement of a job done with the precision and the cost she had promised from the beginning. The press conference lasted 47 minutes. Questions about litigation, about restitution amounts, about Michael Lawson's removal. I answered each one with the measured candor of a man who had nothing left to protect, which was, I discovered, its own form of freedom. Afterward, when the journalists had filed out and the caterers were clearing the coffee urns and the atrium returned to its usual cathedral quiet, Catherine Vale walked to where my father's portrait lay face down on the marble. She looked at it for a long time. Then she stepped over it, not on it, over it, and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the stone floor with a rhythm that sounded, in the empty atrium, like the beginning of a story that had been waiting 40 years to start. I stood beneath the brass letters that would soon read Harrington Vale and pressed my thumb into my palm one last time. The joint cracked. Clean, decisive, the sound of something releasing. Then I put my hands in my pockets and walked outside, into a December afternoon that smelled of snow and diesel and the particular cold clarity of a city that did not care who I had been, only who I was becoming. Emotion. There are conversations that can only happen after someone dies, not because death makes them possible, but because the living person's presence makes them impossible. My father had been a force field. His authority, his certainty, his ability to occupy a room so completely that dissent felt like a breach of physics. Dead, he was finally small enough to talk to. December in Connecticut. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking a town that looked, from this elevation, like a model of itself. The white church steeple powdered with frost, the frozen pond catching winter light like a sheet of hammered silver, the cars creeping along Main Street with their headlights on against the early dark. The grass was dormant, brown, crunching under my shoes with the brittle protest of vegetation that has surrendered to season. The air tasted of cold metal and wood smoke from the houses below, and the silence was the particular silence of a place where the residents have stopped contributing to the conversation. I brought a folding chair. The aluminum frame was cold against my fingers as I unfolded it, the small mechanical clicks echoing in the empty rows like a door being unlocked, and I set it facing my father's headstone with the deliberate positioning of a man arranging a meeting. 2 seats, one occupied, the agenda finally honest. Thomas James Harrington, 1948-2024. Beloved father, devoted husband, builder of legacy. The inscription had been chosen by Evelyn, which now struck me as fitting, one performer writing the epitaph for another. Beloved, devoted, builder. Every word a careful selection from the vocabulary of public virtue, chosen not for accuracy but for effect. The headstone was dark grey granite, polished to a reflective surface that caught my face when I leaned forward. The face of a son who had finally stopped looking at the monument and started reading the foundation. I found everything, Dad. My voice sounded different in the open air. Smaller, uninsulated, stripped of the acoustics that conference rooms and dining rooms and corner offices provide to make human speech feel important. Out here, against the wind and the birds and the vast indifference of a Connecticut winter, my voice was just a voice, a man talking to stone. Catherine Vale, the forged amendment, the shell company, the monthly payments you routed through Meridian Holdings for 33 years, $12,000 a month to keep a woman quiet about the fact that you built your empire on her brain. A crow called from somewhere in the bare oaks that lined the eastern edge of the cemetery. The sound was sharp, interrogative, the bird equivalent of a cross-examination. Here's what I don't understand, I continued. The chair's aluminium frame creaked as I shifted my weight. You preserved her equity. You set up a trust, a separate trust inside the shell company, and you froze her 37% stake in exactly the form it held when you stole it. You didn't liquidate it, emotion chan s. You didn't fold it into the general fund, you kept it whole. 33 years, Dad. You kept the thing you stole in a box labeled with the amount, like a thief who tags every item he takes because he knows, somewhere in the part of himself he can't quite silence, that inventory is a form of confession. The wind moved through the bare branches above me. The sound was skeletal, wood against wood, the friction of things stripped to their essentials. Was it guilt? Was it insurance? Was it some kind of... I searched for the word. The cold air burned in my lungs, and I exhaled a cloud that hung between me and the headstone like a thought made visible. Was it love? Did you love her? Is that why you kept the exact amount? Because destroying it would have meant destroying the evidence that she mattered. The headstone did not answer. Headstones are reliable that way. They hold their silence with a fidelity that the living find almost impossible to maintain. I gave it back, I said. The equity, the name, the public record. Catherine Vale is now co-founder of the company you built with her brain and your fraud. Harrington Capital. The brass letters go up next week. I paused. A car passed on the road below the cemetery, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. A sound like a whisper too distant to decipher. Michael is gone. You probably knew about that too, about him and Evelyn. You knew everything, Dad. That was your gift and your curse. You saw every angle, every vulnerability, every point of leverage in every person you encountered, and you used that knowledge the way an architect uses blueprints, not to understand the building, but to control it. I stood up. The chair scraped against the frozen ground, and the sound was harsh. The sound of a man pushing back from a table. I'm stepping down as CEO, effective January 1st. The board has appointed an interim replacement, someone from outside the family, someone who doesn't carry the name or the debt. Catherine has been offered a seat on the advisory board, which she accepted on the condition that she never has to sit in the chair you used to sit in. I looked at the headstone. The polished granite reflected the winter sky, grey on grey, the stone and the clouds merging into a single surface that was neither earth nor air but something between, the colour of erasure, the colour of a record being expunged. I'm not sure I forgive you. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word for what I feel, because forgiveness implies a debt that can be settled, and what you owe Catherine Vale, what you owe me, isn't the kind of debt that balances, it's structural. It's in the foundation. You can't forgive a foundation. You can only decide whether to build on it or tear it up and start over. The wind gusted. The aluminum chair rocked on the uneven ground, and I steadied it with my foot. A reflex, the automatic gesture of a man who still believed that steadying things was part of his job. I've decided to start over. I folded the chair. The clicks echoed again, this time like a door being locked. I tucked it under my arm and stood for a moment, looking at the headstone the way you look at a building you're about to leave for the last time, with the comprehensive attention of someone memorizing what they've decided to stop carrying. Goodbye, Dad. The word was small, 2 syllables. The same word I had said 1,000 times. Leaving for school, leaving for work, leaving for the office that bore his name. But this time it carried something different. Not anger, not grief, completion, the sound of a conversation finally finished, spoken to a man who was finally listening because he no longer had a choice. I walked down the hill. The frozen grass crunched under my shoes. The town below was beginning to light its windows against the early dark, warm rectangles of amber and gold appearing one by one, like matches being struck in a room that had been waiting for permission to illuminate itself. The car was parked at the iron gate, and the engine was cold, and the drive back to the city would take 2 hours through a landscape I had known my whole life and was only now seeing clearly. I got in, I started the engine. The heater began its slow work of filling the cabin with warmth that had to be earned rather than assumed. My phone lit up on the passenger seat. A text from Marcus. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you told me. I have questions. About Michael. About why he really left. I think I already know the answer, but I need to hear it from you. Can we talk? Not on the phone, face to face." I stared at the words on the screen while the heater slowly warmed the car and the cemetery darkened behind me. My son was asking the question I had chosen not to answer, the question I had protected him from, the question whose answer lived in the mirror every time he looked at his own jawline and saw a geometry that didn't quite match mine. He was ready. The question was whether I was. I put the car in gear and drove toward Brooklyn, carrying my father's silence and my son's courage and the understanding that the hardest conversation of my life was not the one I had just finished. It was the one I was driving toward, emotion. Starting over at 52 feels different than starting over at 22. At 22, you don't know what you're losing, so the loss is abstract, a future you haven't earned yet, relinquished before it takes shape. At 52, you know exactly what you've lost, because you held it and you named it and you built your identity around it, and now the identity and the thing are both gone, and what remains is a man standing in an empty room with a skill set and a question: what do you build when the building is the only thing you know how to do? The studio was in the West Village, 3rd floor, above a bakery whose ovens started at 4 a.m. I learned this on my first morning, waking to the warm, yeasty exhale of bread being born. The smell rising through the floorboards and filling the small apartment with a sweetness so fundamental it felt like a scent the building had always produced, the way the earth produces the smell of rain. The studio had one window facing west, one radiator that clicked and hissed like a small animal complaining about the cold, and a kitchen alcove where the previous tenant had left a set of cast iron hooks in the ceiling. Their purpose mysterious, perhaps for hanging pots, perhaps for drying herbs, perhaps simply for the comfort of knowing that something was anchored above you. I kept the hooks, I hung nothing from them. Their emptiness felt appropriate. January. The city was grey and salt-stained, the sidewalks still carrying the gritty residue of the last snowfall in their cracks and corners. I walked to the coffee shop on the corner, a narrow space called Three Crows, with exposed brick, a tin ceiling painted black, and a barista named Elena who made espresso the way some people play instruments, with the particular concentration of someone who believes that precision in small things is a form of prayer. I ordered a cortado and sat at the counter by the window and opened my laptop, the same clean machine I had bought the night the worried army began its campaign, and I started to work. Not Harrington Capital work. Not the polished machinery of quarterly reports and board presentations and the professional performance of a man wearing his family name like a uniform. Independent work, consulting. A friend from business school, James Chen, the kind of friend who calls not because he's concerned but because he has a problem and remembers you're good at solving them, had referred a small biotech startup that needed restructuring advice. The founder was a woman in her 30s who had built something real from an idea rather than an inheritance, and working with her felt like learning a language I should have spoken all along. The work was small, the fees were modest. The office was a coffee shop, and my assistant was a legal pad, and my wardrobe was a rotation of 3 sweaters I had bought at a store that didn't require appointments. And for the first time in 28 years, the work was mine. Not built on someone else's methodology. Not funded by someone else's stolen equity. Emotion. Not performed beneath brass letters spelling a name that belonged to a lie. Marcus called on a Tuesday. The phone buzzed against the coffee shop counter, and his name, Marcus, appeared on the screen, and I answered with the particular quickness of a father who has learned, through weeks of careful reconstruction, that his son's calls are not obligations but miracles. "Hey Dad, I finished it." "Finished what?" The painting, the big one, the blues and greys. I've been working on it since," he paused, "since everything happened, hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. Since November, it's done. I want you to see it." I closed my laptop. Elena glanced at me from behind the espresso machine. A quick, incurious look. The look of a barista who sees people receive phone calls every day and does not presume to know which ones change the weather. "I'll be there in an hour," I said. The subway ride to Brooklyn was 38 minutes. I stood in the crowded car, holding the overhead bar with one hand, swaying with the motion of the train the way everyone sways. Together, separate, a city of strangers sharing the same physics. The tunnel walls flashed past in their graffiti-streaked rhythm, and the fluorescent light gave everyone the same washed-out complexion, democratizing the differences between faces that looked wealthy, and faces that looked tired, and faces that looked exactly the way mine looked, like a man in transit. Marcus's apartment. The stairwell smelled the same. Cumin, detergent, turpentine, cedar. I climbed 4 flights and knocked, and he opened the door with paint on his hands and a quietness in his green hazel eyes that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen him. We had talked. The conversation I had driven toward from the cemetery, the paternity conversation, had happened the week after Christmas, in this apartment, at this table, over coffee so terrible it had become a tradition. I had told him everything. He had listened, he had cried. He had asked questions I couldn't answer and accepted the ambiguity with a maturity that I, a man twice his age who had spent months unable to accept ambiguity in anyone, found humbling. Emotion. He hadn't taken a DNA test. He said he wasn't ready. He said, "You're my dad. I need that to be enough for now." It was enough. It was more than enough. The painting was against the far wall, and it stopped me at the doorway. 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide. The blues and greys I had seen in November had deepened, layered with undertones of amber and green that moved beneath the surface like currents beneath water. The composition was abstract, no figures, no landmarks, but the motion of the color told a story I recognized. Turbulence giving way to stillness, chaos resolving into something that wasn't order but was peace, a long, slow transition from storm to silence. At the bottom, a thin line of warm gold. Dawn light on a horizon that had been waiting, beneath all those layers of grey, for permission to appear. My God, Marcus. He stood beside me, and his shoulder pressed against mine. The same gesture from the funeral, the same unconscious proximity of a young man who communicates through contact rather than language. "It's called The Invisible Air," he said. The title landed in my chest like a key entering a lock I didn't know I had. The invisible heir, the woman erased from the company she built, the boy whose parentage was uncertain, the man who had spent his life inheriting things that weren't his to inherit. All of us, Catherine, Marcus, me, invisible in different ways, made transparent by the actions of people who valued control over truth. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," I said, and meant it the way you mean something that has no strategic value, no business application, no purpose beyond the devastating, useless, essential fact that it exists and it moves you and it was made by a person you love. Marcus put his arm around my shoulder. The paint on his hands, cadmium yellow, Prussian blue, would stain my sweater, and I didn't care. We stood in his small apartment in Brooklyn, 2 men held together by something stronger than biology, and looked at a painting that said everything we hadn't yet found the words for. 6 months is not long enough to become a different person. It is exactly long enough to stop pretending to be the one you were. The difference is important. I hadn't transformed, I had subtracted, layer by layer, the way you strip wallpaper from a room you've decided to see as it actually is. The plaster beneath, the imperfections, the cracks that someone else covered because they believed that surface was the same as structure. June in New York. The city had shifted into its summer register, the air thick with the accumulated exhale of 8 million bodies carrying the green sweetness of linden trees blooming along the avenues and the hot asphalt scent of streets absorbing sunlight they would release into the night like a fever breaking. I was sitting at 3 Crows on a Saturday morning. The same counter, the same window whose glass was warm against my elbow, the same cortado Elena pulled with the reverent precision of a woman who believed that the difference between good espresso and great espresso was 12 seconds of extraction time and a willingness to care about things most people couldn't taste. The coffee shop smelled of fresh ground beans, the dark, earthy fragrance of Ethiopian single origin, slightly acidic, and the warm pastries the owner's wife brought in from a bakery in Red Hook. Almond croissants, still hot from the oven, their surfaces lacquered with sugar that cracked like thin ice when you bit through to the soft, fragrant frangipane center. The tin ceiling reflected the morning light in small, warped rectangles. The exposed brick behind the counter was the color of dried blood and old history. My laptop was open. The biotech project had expanded. 4 clients now, each one found through the quiet gravitational pull of competence rather than the loud machinery of a name. The fees were enough. The work was honest. I had not bought a suit since December. Marcus walked in at 10:15 with a sketchbook under one arm, a charcoal smudge on his jaw, and a smile that belonged to neither of us, entirely his own, shaped by a face that had stopped trying to resemble anyone and had settled into the particular geometry of a young man who had chosen to be exactly who he was. "Hey, Dad." "Hey." He ordered his oat milk latte. Elena made it with the same precision she gave my cortado, but with the subtle eyebrow of a purist, and sat across from me. The sketchbook opened. Inside, quick charcoal studies of subway faces, each rendered from memory, each carrying the unguarded expression of a person who has temporarily surrendered the performance of public life. "Look at this," he said, turning to a page. A sketch of the Harrington Capital lobby. The brass letters, now supplemented with Catherine's name, rendered in charcoal with a draftsmanship that made the metal look warm. Beneath the letters, a woman's figure walking through the space with the posture of someone who belonged there. Catherine came to the gallery opening last week. Marcus sipped his latte. A smudge of viridian green transferred from his fingertip to the ceramic rim, a green the exact shade of new leaves, of beginnings, of things that grow without instruction. She stood in front of the invisible air for 20 minutes. Then she found me and said, "Your father would have made a terrible painter, but he raised an extraordinary one." I laughed. The sound surprised me. Lighter than I remembered, unencumbered, stripped of the careful modulation that had characterized every sound I'd made for 28 years. The laugh of a man who had stopped monitoring his reactions for strategic value. "You've got paint on your cup," I said. "I know, it's an improvement." We sat and talked about small things. His new series, Subway Portraits, his studio with north light and a landlord indifferent to turpentine. A ceramicist named Yara whose hands, he said, were always cool and dusted with kale and clay, and who made mugs that felt shaped specifically for your particular grip. I listened. I asked questions. I did not steer toward business or legacy or futures he should be planning. I sat across from my son and practiced the art I had spent 52 years failing to master, being present without performing. At noon, Marcus closed the sketchbook, tucked it under his arm and stood. "Same time next week." He hugged me at the door. Quick, one-armed, the hug of a young man who has learned that affection is renewable, available in unlimited supply. Then he walked into the June afternoon and disappeared into the Saturday crowd. One body among thousands, visible and anonymous and entirely himself. I paid the check, stepped outside. Washington Square Park was performing its Saturday matinee. A cellist beneath the arch playing Bach, Suite No. 1 in G major, the prelude that sounds like a river discovering its own current, emotion. Children on the fountain's edge, their laughter arcing over the water like the spray itself. A man selling watercolors. 2 women on a bench, shoulders touching, reading separate books while a dachshund slept in the strip of sunlight between their feet. I walked through it, feeling the sun on my face, actual warmth, the kind that enters through the skin and settles in the muscle, and the concrete beneath thin-soled shoes, and the warm updraft from a subway grate that smelled of ozone and stone, and the underground river of a city that keeps flowing whether or not you know it's there. A man passed me, businessman, navy suit, earpiece, walking with the velocity of someone late for something he believed was important. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. 2 men on a sidewalk in June, sharing 3 seconds before the current carried them apart. I thought of the man I would have been a year ago, the suit, the speed, the belief that velocity was the point. I thought of my father who walked faster than anyone I knew and arrived at a headstone. I thought of Catherine Vale, standing in a gallery, visible at last. My phone buzzed, a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Harrington, this is Dr. Catherine Vale. I'm restructuring the company's research division and I could use a consultant who understands what it's like to start from zero. Coffee next week. I hear there's a place called 3 Crows that makes a decent cortado." I read it twice. Then I laughed. The third honest laugh of the day, the kind that comes from the place where grief and gratitude live so close together that the border between them has dissolved. I typed, same counter, same window, emotion. Tuesday at 10. Then I put the phone in my pocket and walked into the June afternoon, through the bark and the laughter and the smell of linden blossoms and warm stone, building something that was actually mine, emotion.